Hello everybody, and thanks for tuning in. I hope you're all doing well. Now, upon clicking on this video, you probably noticed that this one is 2.5 hours long and concerns all tomorrows, something I haven't made any videos about for a while now. I do feel that I should probably make a quick disclaimer just to temper any super high expectations. I'm sorry to say that this video isn't some sort of brand new mega project that I've been working on for months and months. It is, in fact, a compilation of every All Tomorrow's species profile video that I've ever made, edited together and placed into a specific order that I feel makes sense with regards to the story. But it should, hopefully, provide you with a bit of entertainment. Anyway, I want to say thanks for coming back. I hope you enjoy this big old blast from the past, and please remember to like, comment, share and subscribe, and if you're feeling generous, you can become a patron or member. Now, with all that said, let's get into the video.
The Martians, who we meet near the beginning of C.M. Kozeman's All Tomorrows, are the descendants of the first colonists from Earth to land on Mars. In the All Tomorrows universe, or the Tomorrowverse as it's sometimes referred to as, the first people to set foot on Mars were not astronauts. Instead of sending people to the Red Planet and having them terraform this desolate world once they'd arrived, Earth scientists, starting in the 2100s or the 2200s, began a series of atmospheric bombardments. This was done by sending enormous quantities of Earth-borne microbes to Mars, possibly inside of containers which were transported by self-piloting fusion rockets, which would automatically open once they had reached their destination. It took several centuries for this cycle to create a world that could be inhabited by humans, and after a few hundred years the Earth scientists who had inherited this ambitious project used an unknown technology to alter the trajectory of cometary fragments. These large fragments, made up of ice, would then collide with the surface of Mars and eventually melt to create oceans and other large water bodies. Once this had been accomplished, plants and animals were sent to Mars to further replicate the Earth's ecology. After possibly another couple of hundred years, likely somewhere around the 27th century, humans finally began to leave Earth for Mars. And so, upon arrival, the children who had been brought to Mars by their parents, who were looking for new opportunities, would run out of the ship that had brought them to Mars, filled with wonder and excitement. When their feet touched the newly created biosynthetic grass, these children would officially become the first humans to set foot on another planet. After a few hundred more years, heading into the 30th century, the people of Mars had diverged quite a bit from their Earth-based cousins. The gravity on Mars wasn't as strong as on Earth, and so the people had grown much taller, developing spindly, wiry frames. It is also mentioned that some genetic engineering had taken place too, possibly to modify themselves in such a way to make life in a somewhat unnatural environment easier on them. They had only been on Mars for a few hundred years, and it could be that the human body needed some further adjustments to make life physically comfortable here. As can be seen in the image from this chapter in the book, we are presented with a young male Martian who seems to be somewhere between his late teens and early 30s. He is still very much human, but due to the low gravity that is responsible for his, by Earth standards, extreme height, he also has elongated angular features and a thin face. Put simply, the Martians look like stretched out versions of the people of Earth. He would likely identify as simply Martian, and would probably be a mix of various ethnicities that originated from Earth, who have all interbred over the preceding centuries. It is from this that parallels are drawn in the book between these new Martians and the people of the present-day United States of America. As the USA eventually developed its own cultural identity and broke away from Great Britain, so too did the people of Mars wish to forge their own path, without having to answer to the Earth-based global government which had a tight stranglehold on Mars and would reap the rewards of the Martians' hard work. It is because of this that they are referred to as the Martian Americans in this section of the book. The Martians were driven, hard-working and intelligent people, by this point more than capable of looking after their own affairs. Earth needed Mars, far more than Mars needed Earth. The culture on Mars by this point had become very anti-Earth. The old planet was now seen as being a drain on their newly created world, which was making great strides in all areas while Earth's society seemed to stagnate, seeming to have achieved all that it could. Sending humans to another planet was the end goal for Earth, and it had done this, but it seemed to the Martians that Earth didn't know when to call it quits and hand things over to a younger, more energetic inheritor. Earth had become a splendorous place at this point in time, a fantastic place to live no matter which country you were in, but much of its wealth had been siphoned from Mars. It was inevitable that the Martians would get sick of this eventually. Somewhere around the 31st century, Mars had had enough, and Earth was virtually cut off. Non-essential trade and travel between Earth and Mars was made illegal, and only in a few very special circumstances were people allowed to travel between the two. Only essential goods and personnel were allowed in and out of the Martian borders high up in the clouds. This was great news for Mars, as it could now keep its self-generated wealth to itself. It was terrible news for Earth, and meant that most people lost up to 3/4 of their annual income. War was inevitable. Earth declared war on Mars, and this interstellar conflict would become the bloodiest, most violently destructive war in human history, so far. Enormous war machines were used by the two planets against each other, which were capable of performing the most infinitesimal calculations with regards to when and where to strike their enemy. At one point, the Mars moon Phobos was obliterated, and meteorite hail rained down on Mars, killing an untold number of its citizens. They retaliated by causing a polar impact on Earth, which killed billions of people. The Earth people and the Martians eventually realized that what they were doing was frankly idiotic. They ended the war and vowed to take steps to make sure that such a catastrophic event would never happen again. The people of Mars were now more advanced in every way than the people of Earth, possessing technologies that could only have been created by highly driven, dynamic Martians. But Earth still had its ancient wisdom and, as much as it may have pained the Martians to admit it, Earth was their ancestral home. Without Earth, there would have been no Mars, or no Mars civilization anyway. After centuries of tensions, hatred, and an uneasy alliance constantly on the verge of breaking, the two planets finally came together and made peace. But the people of Earth and Mars knew that, despite their newfound love for one another, true unification would never be possible between them, as over the centuries they had grown to become extremely different to one another in their appearance, attitudes, ideas, cultures, and ways of life. While they had a new respect for one another, they knew that the only way for the human race to truly progress was for a new kind of human to be created. Mars had become highly adept at genetic engineering, and Earth had made a great many advances in this field too. With their combined technologies and knowledge, the two planets' brightest minds got to work on a new and ambitious project which would, hopefully, ensure the survival of their species: the creation of the Star People. After the Star People had come into being, Mars isn't mentioned again in the book. The Star People went off to colonize Venus, Saturn, and many asteroids before moving on to planets beyond our solar system. They had left Earth and Mars behind, and what happened to Mars is unknown. It could be that after the creation of the Star People, Mars simply kept to itself after that and only really engaged with Earth. They knew that, despite their incredible accomplishments in the sciences and all other fields, that it was only a matter of time before it was made obsolete by what the Star People were capable of. Perhaps the Martians felt that their duty to humankind was not to save it themselves, but to create those who would. Maybe Earth felt the same way. They had met their destiny in producing the next step in human evolution within laboratories. They had accomplished their mission. They would let the Star People take over and had passed the torch to them, for they were now responsible for carrying the human race forward. Mars would then continue to work on its own problems alongside Earth, the two planets now only associating with each other, not wanting to slow down the Star People or get in their way. Mars and Earth would spend the remainders of their existences as peaceful, wise and enlightened civilizations, no longer trying to colonize other planets, no longer engaging in senseless wars. They had reached the point where they knew that it was best for them to stay put on their own two worlds and not venture any further. And when their time finally came, they would embrace it with open arms, as even though they were about to meet their end, their species' future, at least for a time, was secure. The Star People are a race of superior genetically engineered human beings, first introduced in C.M. Kozeman's 2006 book, All Tomorrows. The creation of the Star People came about following a deeply traumatic and horrifying interplanetary war between Earth and its former colony Mars, somewhere around the 31st century. After the war, the peoples of both planets made peace and took measures to ensure that such a devastating war would never happen again, one of these measures being the creation of the Star People. Because the peoples of Earth and Mars over the centuries had diverged considerably in culture, lifestyle and also in physical appearance, owing to the differing levels of gravity between the two planets, they concluded that the only way to bring true unity to the human race was to create a brand new version of humanity, one that would lead the human race into the future, and so the Star People were born. The Star People were designed and then genetically engineered in a collaboration between Earth and Mars scientists. The idea was to make the new humans superior to their predecessors in both intellect and talent, and they were given larger brains and also much more versatile bodies, able to survive and thrive on Earth, Mars, and also on newly terraformed planets. The environments of many of these new worlds wouldn't be easy to withstand for the average 31st century human, be they from Earth or Mars, but the new Star People had no such difficulties. To begin with, the Star People were organized into a single state where only their kind lived, though whether this was on Earth or Mars was never explicitly stated in the book. The new state's infrastructure was aided by the technologies that had been developed during the Great Earth-Mars War, and Mars was said to have overtaken Earth in many ways by this point, and so I would personally think that this newly formed state would be situated somewhere on Mars. It can be assumed that the Star People, in their own territory, stayed more or less separate from the old humans, perhaps with only minimal contact taking place so as to not taint the Star People's way of thinking. The aim here was to create a new kind of human, one that would remain forever unified and never engage in acts of war against themselves. They would likely have been kept away from the older human species so as to not taint themselves or poison their minds with old, outdated ways of thinking. After a few generations, the Star People had made great advances in a number of areas, including real space travel and planetary colonization. This, even for the brilliant Star People, was not easy. They attempted to send colonists to new worlds in generation ships, which would house the new settlers on their long journey. This didn't work out, however, due to technical difficulties, and also, the colonists on board these ships had a tendency to go stir crazy, and anarchy would ensue. They then decided to try another method. Smaller ships were constructed and then sent off to new worlds with samples of human DNA stored on board, along with semi-sentient machines that would, upon reaching their destination, get to work on creating the new colonists from the stored DNA. This was again fraught with difficulties, as some of the newly made colonists would grow an intense affection for the machines that created them, considering them their true parents and rejecting their own kind. Then, after a massive identity crisis, they would commit suicide. Not everyone born of machines suffered this fate, however, with around half of the colonization attempts succeeding and managing to populate a large portion of humanity's spiral arm of the Milky Way. Following this was a true golden age for humanity, in which the thousands of planets colonized by the Star People worked together to advance the human race in ways previously unimagined. People lived lives that were richer in both the material and cultural sense than that of some countries in the 21st century. There were no wars, as war was not in the Star People's nature. They had been designed as thinkers, problem solvers, intellectuals, and engineers, whose purpose was to push the human race into an era of true enlightenment. This golden age lasted for a very long time indeed, but sadly, it could not last forever. While the Star People had come across alien life countless times on their galactic travels, they had never come across any truly intelligent beings, until they did. The first sign came when they discovered a fossilized creature, a highly evolved dinosaur, originating from Earth, which didn't fit in biologically with the rest of the native animals on the planet where it was found. Someone, or something, had taken it from Earth and brought it here, but the question was, who had done this? It wouldn't be long before the Star People found out. The Star People, at some point, came into contact with the alien race known as the Q. The Star People's downfall came in less than 1,000 years. The Q saw what the Star People had done to this corner of the galaxy, their galaxy as far as the Q was concerned. The Q decided that the infidels needed to be punished, and punished they certainly were. The Star People fought back, of course, with one world even managing to turn back 2 successive waves of Q invasion before falling to the third. War, as it was said before, was not in the Star People's nature. They were concerned only with progressing their own civilization, but now their civilization was gone. The Q, masters of genetic manipulation, changed the Star People into a variety of strange and terrible forms. This was the Q's mission, and they used the Star People as the genetic base material to create all kinds of new life forms. They were all reduced to the level of animals and hunter-gatherers, and everything the Star People had done, all of the wonders they had accomplished, were destroyed or lost to the sands of time. All was not lost, however, as some of the Q-created post-humans would survive and begin the evolutionary process again. Some Star People even managed to evade the Q and carved out new lives for themselves within hollowed-out asteroids, themselves evolving into new and strange forms. The Star People were gone, but their legacy was not. They would, in new forms, re-emerge and spread throughout the galaxy once again. The Q, when we first meet them, are a billion-year-old alien race first introduced in C.M. Kozeman's 2006 book, All Tomorrows. They are easily identified by their 4 wings, which they use to fly, similar to that of the present-day dragonfly, and also to hover in mid-air, hummingbird style. They possess long tails which are highly prehensile, and used to manipulate objects and use equipment and horrific instruments, chiefly those used for the purposes of genetic manipulation. They have 2 eyes which sit on the ends of optical stalks, and possess mandibles on their faces, giving the Q an incredibly insect-like appearance, and they are commonly referred to as giant dragonflies, alien dragonflies, or variations of these by some members of the All Tomorrows fandom online. It is stated in the book that the Q's life cycle includes a water-based larval stage, which perhaps served as their inspiration for the making of some of their aquatic post-human creations, like the swimmers. Their physical appearance is a result of genetic engineering, conducted on themselves over countless millions of years in an effort to constantly improve and change themselves to achieve perfection. Genetic engineering and also nanotechnology have been mastered by the Q, and at first contact with humanity are not known to have any equals anywhere in the universe who can rival their level of absolute mastery over these technologies. They are known to utilize nanotechnological drones as well as genetically modified tracing creatures, likely used for tracking and/or rooting out living creatures attempting to hide from them. Aside from these, it is a certainty that they will have used other creatures and other nanotechnological devices to achieve their means, though it is never specifically stated what these are. The Q are the absolute definition of megalomania, and as a race possess a god complex that beats anything that came before them. Their ability to change, control, redesign and wipe out entire worlds and manipulate the material world caused them to assume a religious, self-imposed mission to remake the universe as they saw fit. And they did just that. travelling throughout the cosmos to each spiral arm of every galaxy they came across, modifying every world, every environment, and every living thing into bizarre, baffling, and horrifying bastardizations of their former selves. Once they had changed the world and its inhabitants, it seems that they would stay and watch over their grotesque creations for a certain amount of time, before abruptly leaving them and their world to fend for itself. They are described in the book as being galactic nomads, meaning that once they had finished their work in one galaxy, they would move on to another to begin their twisted work in genetic engineering once again. Their first contact with humanity came when they encountered the Star People, who were genetically created by the peoples of Earth and Mars following a catastrophic interplanetary war between the two, somewhere roughly in the 31st century. The Q were deeply offended that the Star People had been doing their own work in reshaping the universe, and so they set about punishing them in the most cruel and elaborate ways. While the Star People, on their many planets, were prepared for a violent confrontation with the fanatic alien species, most were defeated with relative ease. These poor souls were soon changed, genetically modified beyond recognition into a variety of strange and unrecognizable post-human forms, and with their sentience taken from them and their bodies turned into a myriad of horrors. The Star People on one world, who had managed to put up a fierce resistance and were able to turn back 2 successive waves of Q invasion before falling to the third, suffered perhaps the most horrific fate of all the Star People. They were turned into the Colonials, sheets of human flesh with eyes and full consciousness, stitched together and used to filter the sewage of Q society. The Q evidently had little to no empathy for their subjects, and displayed levels of cruelty that would even give humanity a run for its money. The Q, after leaving their creations behind, disappeared to find and modify other unknown lifeforms in other galaxies, upon which these new human forms began, once again, to embark on the evolutionary process, many eventually regaining their sentience. The Q were later re-encountered many millions of years later by highly evolved forms of their own creations which had by this point formed the Second Galactic Empire. They were finally subdued and defeated by the post-humans, though their eventual fate remains unknown.
40 meters long and elephantine in appearance, the Titans are a post-human, Q-created species that roamed the endless savannas of its world, a former colonial outpost inhabited by the ancient Star People. These enormous beings are the second Q creation that we're introduced to in the story of All Tomorrows, and despite their gigantic size and physiology, the Titans were actually one of the more intelligent of them all. This was due to their immense size, as a large physical form meant that the development of a large brain was possible, and did eventually happen. They still possessed stubby thumbs on their front appendages, now used for digging up tree roots. Whether these were a part of the initial Q design, or had re-evolved naturally after the Q had left, is unknown. Also of note is their long lower lip, which further intensified their resemblance to the elephants of old Earth. This lower lip would in time become their main hand, and would be a prehensile appendage used to manipulate objects and interact with the world. The Titans, after an unspecified amount of time, had regained their sentience. They would develop the capability to create art in the form of ornate wooden carvings, and they would begin to erect large dwellings the size of an aircraft hangar of old Earth. They would also develop a primitive form of agriculture, and these gentle giants would also begin to speak in their own languages. After much time, they would move past their nomadic lifestyles and begin to settle in large communities. With this came distinct cultures, in which stories and myths of their ancient past were told and circulated amongst themselves. Just how much they remembered or knew is unknown, and whether they truly understood their past as Star People is never revealed. These gentle giants would survive and thrive for a long time, passing through the stage of hunter-gatherer and eventually reaching the stage of creating early primitive civilizations. However, this was sadly not to last. If luck were on their side, the Titans could have easily reached a high level of advancement and stood alongside their distant cousins as members of the Second Galactic Empire.
But before they could ever come close to reaching this stage, a catastrophic ice age would envelop the Titans' homeworld, causing their extinction. The Bone Crushers from C.M. Kozeman's All Tomorrows are a race of humanoids created by the Q using captured star people as the base genome. While a great many of the Q created future humans hardly resemble their Homo sapiens ancestors, the Bone Crushers, for the most part, look quite human indeed. Mostly. They are bipedal and walk upright, and still possess 5 digits on each hand and foot. However, as is always the case with the Q, changes were certainly made. One of these is the fact that the average Bone Crusher stands at around 3 meters in height and are strongly built for their primitive lifestyle. Another is the fact that they now possess a sharp raptor-like thumb claw. And another yet is that they would show their affection for one another by defecating upon them. Try not to imagine what a Bone Crusher party, wedding or date would look like. But the main change, easily the most striking, is the fact that they possess large, tooth-derived beaks. The reason for this is that the ancestors of the Bone Crushers from several millions of years before them were pint-sized pets of the Q. It would seem that the Q were quite fond of keeping pets, as they had also bred the hedonists on another far-flung world for this very purpose. The beaks of these little Q pets were said to come in an array of dazzling colours, and were specifically bred this way. As the Q always did, they left the planet behind after a few million years, and with this abandonment, most of the breeds they had created died off, save for a small amount who were particularly hardy. Some of these became herbivorous, and were preyed upon by others which became enamel-beaked raptors. But one would eventually emerge as the dominant life form on their garden world, the one form to develop sentience and human-level intelligence. They would progress throughout the millennia and would manage to reach a level of primitive civilization, something that could be compared to our medieval period. This form would become the species known as the Bone Crushers. They had achieved civilization against all odds, but sadly the Bone Crushers would progress no further. Owing to their unusual diet, which consisted exclusively of rotting flesh, the Bone Crushers would see their numbers dwindle. They would never make it as far as their distant cousins on other worlds, and after a few uneventful millennia, the Bone Crushers would die out. The peaceful, delicate Striders from C.M. Kozeman's All Tomorrows are a post-human species created by the Q from Star People DNA. The Striders are extremely tall, though the book does not give any exact dimensions. However, it does state that the world they live on has extremely low levels of gravity. The grass on this world grows to around 10 meters high, and the trees higher still, to around the height of the skyscrapers found on old Earth. As the Q had designed the Striders for life in these conditions, it can be estimated that they were taller than the height of the 10-meter high grass. In the illustration we're provided with, we can see a Strider individual against a background of grass and trees. It isn't certain, but if the grass in this image is 10 meters high, then the individual seen here would be around 90 to 100 meters in height. We do know that the Q were capable of creating life forms that were enormous in size, as is the case with the 40-meter long Titans. With this in mind, it would be safe to say that the Q having the ability to create a 100-meter tall future human isn't too much of a stretch, if you'll pardon the pun. The physiology of the Striders is interesting, in that aside from their gigantic proportions, they also possess flaps of flesh which were used to expel excess heat. Overheating was a big problem for the Striders, owing to their height and fragility. They are also somewhat chameleonic, as they were able to change the colour of their skin. This was usually done in an effort to keep cool, meaning that they would have the ability to reflect light or absorb it, depending on the circumstances. Among the other problems that plagued the Striders' existence was the fact that they were so thin and fragile that even a bad fall could spell their doom. Just falling over could shatter their weak bones, and a fall from even a low tree branch, or even getting caught in a strong wind, could blow them over and kill them. It was only due to the incredibly forgiving ecology of their world that they managed to survive as long as they did. With very little gravity, plenty of food and no predators, the Striders would manage to live for around 2 million years after the Q left their world to conquer others. But, as with all things, the Striders' time in existence came to an end, this time at the hands of highly evolved chickens. Descended from Earth poultry, which the Star People had brought with them to this world, a species of feral dinosaur-like creature would sweep through the forests and plains of this once peaceful planet, killing anything that couldn't fight them off or escape. The docile, herbivorous Striders were among the first to go. Deep underground, miles below the surface of their far-flung planet, the blind folk from CM Kozeman's All Tomorrows live in complete darkness. Their story begins, as with all of the post-humans, with an invasion by the Q. The blind folk were star people once, who originated on Earth and Mars, but had managed to colonize much of the Milky Way. The Q, an alien race hell-bent on genetically modifying all life within the universe to their liking, made their way through all of the Star People's worlds, changing them. On one world, the Star People had made their way underground in an effort to evade the Q and hopefully go unnoticed. It didn't work, however. The Q located them with ease and modified them into barely recognizable forms. Having found them hiding underground, the Q decided to remake them in such a way so that they could remain underground permanently. It would seem that the Q had a dark sense of humour, if you'll pardon the pun. After the Q disappeared, the underground environments, the shelters, would no longer be maintained, and nature would take over once again. A steady trickle of water and a flow of nutrients from above would sustain the bizarre lifeforms below. The kilometre-high ceilings would glow with bioluminescent fungi, and a number of animals would emerge. Crocodilian fish, distorted birds, and giant pale insects would evolve from the household pets of the Star People, and that's not to mention the Star People themselves and what they now looked like. As their name would suggest, they had been remade into a new being that did not possess the power of sight. There was no need for it underground. Instead, these strange post-humans would use echolocation to find their way around. This took the form of banshee-like screams, which echoed and bounced around in the cold darkness. Their skin is extremely pale, as it would never see the sun above. They had developed long tactile fingers to feel their way around in the blackness. Their ears were now huge and rodent-like, and they had also developed long whiskers, also useful for a life underground. In the image presented, we can see an adult male member of the blind folk, along with his young daughter. He knows to stay still to confuse predators who possess sonar capabilities, but his young daughter throws her arms up in terror at the presence of an unfamiliar being. While the blind folk had every incentive to evolve and eventually leave their underground homes in order to conquer the surface world and eventually the stars, like their cousins on other worlds, they would never make it out of their subterranean environment. The glacial constriction of their world's continental plates would mean that, one by one, the blind folks' shelters would be crushed, resulting in their extinction. The Temptor from CM Kozeman's popular 2006 book All Tomorrows are a post-human race. In the beginning, they were Star People, who had been created by Earth and Mars scientists with the express purpose of taking the human race into the future and colonizing the galaxy. This lasted for a time, but eventually the Star People encountered the Q, an alien race whose mission was to find and genetically remake every living thing that they found. On one world, the Temptor were the result of this campaign of genetic modification. They were originally bred as decorations, which would be spread about on the now Q-conquered world. They could be described as a sort of human houseplant. In the illustration we're provided with, we can see both a male and female member of this species. The book states that the males would perform mindless tasks, while the females would give the orders. But now we'll take a look at how they're different to modern humans. The female of the species is shown to be a 2-meter tall beaked cone of flesh. They root themselves deep into the ground and remain stationary for the majority of their lives once planted by the males. They still possess eyes and mouths and possibly noses, which I think is this part here, though I'm not certain. They also seem to have a leaf-shaped growth which protrudes from the flesh near their mouths. This doesn't seem to serve any specific function and could simply be a cosmetic feature, as they were used as living decorations in their early days. They control the males by use of pheromones and vocal signals, which guide them and instruct them on which tasks they are to perform at any given time. They also seem to have their limbs, their arms and legs, though of what use these could possibly be is unknown. Maybe it's like male nipples. They're there, but they don't do anything. The males look rather different, as if from a different species altogether. They're much smaller and perfectly mobile. Some would spend their time bringing food for the females, others would clean them, and others would keep lookout, protecting the females from danger. One similarity of note, however, is their beaks. Their hands seem to be of much the same shape as well. The females would choose the strongest, most obedient and least intelligent males to become sexual partners, and while males seem to be born most often, occasionally baby females would be born, which the males would then carry off so that they could root themselves. Their species would seem like one which had a lot of potential, one that could one day re-evolve human sentience and begin the long journey towards civilization. However, this would not come to pass. The end of the Temptor species would come as a result of a stray comet which hit their world and obliterated them before they could reach their full potential. First introduced in C.M. Kozeman's 2006 book All Tomorrows, the hand flappers are a post-human Q-created species. Beginning their lives as star people, the hand flappers were initially modified into a flying species which would populate enormous alien gardens that the Q would spend time in, possibly as a part of religious practices, or maybe it was simple recreation. As the Q always did, they eventually left this world, and with it, the species that they had created. One such species was the hand flappers. Unlike another flying species made by the Q, known as the Flyers, the hand flappers did not have any augmented body parts, as is the case with the Flyers' starfish-shaped hearts, which would pump blood to all of their extremities at once. They were also not fortunate enough to live on a world with low gravity. All of this meant that they would have no choice but to eventually give up their power of flight altogether. Their wings were once used in a fluttering butterfly type of fashion, but the book states that they would eventually shrink down, meaning their wings would have been considerably larger in their distant past. Having to cease flying altogether on its own would be considered a bit of a blow evolution-wise, but what also came along with that was the fact that they would also never re-evolve the hands that their Star People ancestors possessed, meaning that they were simply left with a pair of useless wing flaps. Their legs would also prove to be problematic, as they would remain in a splayed, bowed gait owing to the perching lifestyle of their previous form. Unlike some of the other post-humans who could have re-evolved their sapients given enough time, it would seem that the hand flappers were always doomed. All they could do with their flag-like former hands was use them for sexual displays. They could not use them to craft weaponry, basic stone tools, or build shelter, and as such, after a relatively short time in existence, the hand flappers would die out. Condemned to lives of hopelessness and misery, the Mantelopes are a post-human species that we first meet in C.M. Kozeman's popular 2006 book All Tomorrows. The Mantelopes had originally been bred by the Q from the Star People as singers and memory retainers. This sort of thing was not unusual for the Q. Many of their creations were made with an express purpose in mind, examples being the Bone Crushers and the Hedonists, who were designed as pets. Another example would be the Temptor, who were designed to act as decorations on Q-conquered worlds. It would seem that the Q also enjoyed music, and so this species was bred to provide them with this form of entertainment. Their other function, as memory retainers, is somewhat unclear. Perhaps they were used as living hard drives, used for storing precious information within their minds, which were artificially advanced and expanded. This could also explain one of the most unsettling aspects of the Mantelopes' existence, which would become their norm once the Q had left their world behind.
For you see, after the Q left, the Mantelopes would revert to a four-legged form. What their previous form, under Q reign, looked like is unknown. But with this new form, which resembles a sort of camel-horse hybrid with very obvious human characteristics in the face, they would live the lives of grazing herd animals while retaining the intelligence and self-awareness of human beings. This reversion was an abrupt change, and one that was only possible due to the forgiving artificial biosphere set in place by the Q. This rapid change into a new form, coupled with the shock of being conquered by the Q and used as forced, unwilling entertainment units, and topped off with the fact that they were fully conscious of everything that was happening around them, would severely traumatize the Mantelopes as a species for the rest of their days. They would live lives of quiet misery. Their intelligent minds would formulate solutions to their many problems, but without fingers and thumbs, they could never bring these solutions to pass. They would spend their lives wandering their planet, singing songs of desperation and pain, doing little other than grazing and wishing more than anything that they could be freed from their bodily prisons. They would develop religions centered entirely around their despair. In terms of time, however, their suffering would be short-lived. They would spend hundreds of years living this way, with generation after generation living in this hopeless condition. However, an advanced mind was not advantageous to have unless it could be put to good use, and so, in less than 100,000 years, the Mantelopes would relinquish their intelligence and spend the rest of their time in existence as beasts. Their history, their achievements, their lives, forgotten. The Colonials, first introduced in C.M. Kozeman's book All Tomorrows, are a future human species and descendants of the Star People. On one colonized world, far from Earth in deep space, the Q swarmed across the planets trying to take it over so that they may perform horrific genetic modifications on its inhabitants. The Star People of this world, unlike those of other worlds, had managed to hold their ground and turn away 2 successive waves of invasion. These repulsive insect-like aliens weren't going to give up, however, and eventually the Star People were overwhelmed. Upon the 3rd wave of invasion, the Q had successfully penetrated the Star People's defences, and they began to seep in and take hold of their newly conquered planet and its people. The Q were deeply offended at the Star People's resistance, and the fact that it had taken 3 attempts to subdue them was an outrage. The Q were gods, and to go up against the gods was a crime that could not go unpunished. While the Star People on other worlds had been changed into strange animals and had had their sapience taken away from them, it was nothing compared to what would soon happen to the people of this world. It was decided by the Q that these people must suffer horribly for their crimes. They were modified genetically into what is perhaps the most horrific form that we're presented with in the entire story. The Colonials, former humans, were now merely living sheets of human flesh. Their entire form was comprised of skin, muscle, eyes, and reproductive organs. They had an extremely basic network of nerves, just enough to keep them alive and in agony. They were able to reproduce in the traditional way, as well as asexually. They had eyes so that they could see their wretched existence, and they had full consciousness so that they could comprehend it. They would all live together, fused to one another, unable to move or change anything about their existence. They had no mouths with which to scream. But this was not all that their new lives consisted of. If they were to merely be forced to stay in one place for eternity, cursed to be forever stationary and to have nothing to do but think, this may have become somewhat bearable with time. But no, there was more to their punishment. They would also be forced to act as a sewage filtering system for the Q society, which had now taken over their planet. They would spend their entire lives doing nothing but eating and absorbing Q feces. While the Colonials didn't have mouths, the Q had absolute torture in mind when they designed them to be living sewage processors. It can then be theorized that within their skin, which absorbed the waste,
They would likely have also had their taste buds retained, and perhaps the sensitivity of their taste buds was amplified as well. They would spend an agonizing 40 million years living like this, until the Q eventually up and left the planet. When the Q left, the Colonials had hoped that they would quickly die off, now that there was no Q waste to sustain them. However, they didn't go extinct, and theirs eventually became a nightmare world, completely blanketed in living, conscious flesh. They lived like this for several more millions of years, eventually evolving to regain their mobility and becoming the modular people. But before they managed this, theirs truly was a long and hellish existence. The Asymmetrics are a future human race from CM Kozeman's All Tomorrows. In the beginning, the Q had invaded one of the many Star People worlds and fully conquered the planet. As was always the case with the Q and their vanquished victims, they had genetic modification in mind. The Star People of this world were rounded up and then transported to another world, one with 36 times the amount of gravity found on Earth. Quite why the Q did this is unknown. All we know is that it was part of their fanatically driven religious crusade to remake the universe as they saw fit. Once they had reached this world of immense gravity, the Star People were genetically remade for life on this new planet. They became a species known as the Lopsiders. The Lopsiders had been squashed flat, and their two eyes were now on the upside of their heads, resembling the flatfish of old Earth. 3 of their limbs had been made into paddle-like appendages used to push themselves along the ground, while their 4th limb, an arm, was longer and used as a sort of sensory organ, like an insect's antenna. Despite what would seem to us to be certain doom for the Lopsiders, the human spark still remained within them. Their sentience had been taken from them by the Q, but it would eventually return. They thrived on their new world, and would eventually regain their human intelligence and begin to progress much like their future human cousins on other worlds. After a few million years, the Lopsiders would achieve civilization. It was a civilization of squat buildings, no more than a few meters high. These structures, however, were merely the entrances to underground schools, homes, workplaces, and various other institutions like prisons, embassies, and military command centers, etc. Being human, the Lopsiders, upon reaching the point where they were technologically able to traverse the void of space, wanted to go forth and colonize new worlds. The only problem was that none of the planets in their solar system had sufficient levels of gravity. It was at this point that the Lopsiders, in a series of events that somewhat paralleled what had happened with Earth, Mars, and the creation of the Star People millions of years before, got to work on creating a species from themselves that would be better suited to space travel and colonization. It would take thousands of years to achieve even limited success in this endeavour, but eventually a species was born, or rather, made. This species was the asymmetric people. Their bodies were changed so that they may move about more freely on the newly colonised worlds with less gravity. They took on a somewhat centipedal appearance. The individual in the illustration, an asymmetric nobleman, has 8 legs. He still retains one large hand for reasons unknown, indicating that the genetic engineering capabilities of the Lopsiders, while good enough to create a new version of themselves, was far from perfect. The other arm has been extended in length and could be used to manipulate objects and use equipment. Whether it still functioned as an antenna-like sensory organ, like the one possessed by their ancestors, is unknown. Their faces had inadvertently rotated and were now, from our viewpoint, upside down, as their bodies were altered to stand upright. As is the case with humans and human-derived species, tensions between the Lopsiders and the now quite different Asymmetrics arose. Eventually, war would break out, and unlike the Star People who didn't wipe out the people of Earth and Mars, the Asymmetrics wiped out their creators. Now fully independent, they looked to the stars for further exploits. Much time would pass and much progress would be made. Eventually, the Asymmetrics would discover the ruins of the Star People and the Q, and would use these new discoveries and the knowledge that came with them to achieve things unimaginable to us in the 21st century. They had also theorized, after learning of the events involving the Star People and the Q, that there may be other future humans like them out there, and so they began to broadcast signals into space in the hopes of reaching them. They did. The asymmetric people would be among the second wave of species to join the Second Galactic Empire, an interplanetary union of several worlds inhabited by the evolved forms of Q-created former humans. For 80 million years, the Empire flourished, until it was destroyed by another future human species called the Gravital, who had implanted their minds into machine bodies and considered themselves the true heirs to the Star People, and set about exterminating all others, deeming them unworthy. The Asymmetrics were now extinct, wiped out with only the smallest of traces left behind. They were gone, but would not be entirely forgotten. Descendants of the Colonials, the most unfortunate of all the post-humans from all tomorrows, the Modular people are a race quite unlike any of the others that we meet in the book. Their ancestral past, a grotesque form forced upon them by the Q, had individuals stitched together with only a basic network of nerves connecting them. They were also forced to retain full consciousness. But once the Q had left and evolution began to take its course without intervention, the Colonials would emerge from their horrific lives and start to reclaim their humanity, albeit in a strange new way. As the hundreds of thousands of years slowly passed, these horrifying world-covering flesh sheets would begin to organise themselves into colonies. Within these colonies, each individual, each human cell, would begin to perform a sole function that would benefit the colony as a whole. This would give rise to the Great Age of Organisation, a time when all of the different colonies would compete by developing specialised human cells, which would give them the edge over the competition. Some did this by developing roots which could siphon resources from vast distances, while others managed to become mobile by developing starfish-like foot segments. Others developed armour plating, and some developed enormous eyes and became the colony's designated watchers and lookouts. Eventually, one colony would emerge victorious over all the others, a colony that was organised around specialised human cells whose only purpose was to direct the others. This developed into a strict hierarchy of leaders and followers, and once they had evolved to the point where they could combine and recombine at will into a single unit, the Modular people were born. While we only have one image containing two Modular people made up of many individual parts, the book describes some of the incredible forms that the Modulars could take. The book describes castle-like guardian forests to diminutive scuttling couriers. One can only imagine what their world looked like. It would seem that the Modulars didn't just connect themselves together to form sentient individuals, but that they could also come together to form other structures, such as living buildings, somewhat reminiscent of the tool breeders who inhabited another far-flung planet, who used sea life for their infrastructure. And in time, the Modular people and the tool breeders would come into contact with one another, along with the other members of the Second Galactic Empire, which was made up of a number of other Q-creation descendants. For many tens of millions of years, the Modular people would thrive within the Empire, exchanging information and experiences with the other members and achieving wonders. Until their eventual extinction at the hands of the Gravital, a race of machines with human implanted minds who considered the Modular people and the rest of the Empire as unworthy of existence. The Modular people were now gone, but their story showed us that even a species as lowly as the Colonials could survive and achieve great things, given enough time. The individual cells of the Modulars had fought for their existence, they had come together and relied on each other. The whole truly is greater than the sum of its parts. One of many descendants of Q-modified star people, the Saurosapients are perhaps one of the more unusual species to come out of the long series of Q invasions that take place in the story of All Tomorrows. On one lush tropical world, the star people forcibly underwent modifications which, unlike their cousins on other worlds, did not involve drastic changes to their physical forms. Instead, the Q had chosen to remove their sentience and stunt the development of their brains. This did not, however, mean that they couldn't regain their sentience in time. They could have done so and had every incentive to, being the most highly evolved lifeform on their world. But perhaps this is, in fact, the very reason they never would re-evolve. There were no predators on their planet. It would seem that these subhumans grew complacent, and without the need to adapt to evade dangerous situations, they would stagnate and their evolutionary journey would more or less come to a halt. As with all modified species, the Q's reasoning behind these specific changes is not known. All we know is that they regarded themselves as gods, with the divine right to change the galaxy around them in any way they desired. After a time, these people would begin to instinctively herd some of the animals on their world, the descendants of pets and livestock brought from Earth. Quite why they began doing this is unknown. Maybe it was a small, fragmented piece of their former humanity, a tiny amount of instinct that hadn't been removed by the Q, which still lay buried within their psyche, a neural connection that hadn't been severed. It would seem that the majority of these people eventually began farming lizards, hence the name assigned to them in the book, the lizard herders. It was a tropical world that these beings inhabited, and this would give the lizards an edge over all the other lifeforms, and instead of the modified humans beginning to evolve again to become the masters of this domain, it would instead be the lizards that would take control. The lizards would spend many millions of years evolving into a brand new sentient species, a form that would come to be known as the Saurosapients. The idea of lizards evolving to become sentient may seem like science fiction to many, but when you consider the fact that we humans, according to modern scientific theory, were at one point lizards ourselves in our distant evolutionary past, the idea of the Saurosapients becoming an intelligent race suddenly doesn't seem quite so wacky. The lizard herders themselves would descend further and further into animalistic forms, but the Saurosapients would go on to reach the point of true intelligence, building their first civilizations. Having now reached true sapience, the Sauros naturally began exploring their world and came across the ancient ruins of the Star People and the Q. Archaeological efforts would eventually reveal the truth to them about their past, and they would also come to understand that the beasts that they used for food and labour were in fact the descendants of the Star People. The Sauros, understandably, were rattled by these discoveries, and differing schools of thought began to emerge in the aftermath. Some factions would begin to cope by forming religions, perhaps worshipping the Q, the Star People, or both. Maybe if they worshipped the Q, they wouldn't enact any harsh punishments on them if they ever returned to their world. The Saurosapients were deeply unsettled and had become frightened by what may be out there amongst the stars. But after a few centuries of technological progress and achieving a deeper understanding of the galaxy, the many factions would come together in unity and become just as human as the other beings whose existence the Q were responsible for. The Saurosapients would continue to evolve and would eventually reach out to the rest of their galaxy, establishing contact with the other intelligent future humans of the story. They eventually would join the interplanetary union known as the Second Galactic Empire, being among the third wave of species to join, around 20 million years into its existence. For a further 60 million years, the Sauros would serve as dutiful members of the Empire, achieving wonders of which we couldn't even begin to imagine. However, after 80 million years, they would become victims of a galaxy-wide genocide at the hands of the Machine Empire. The Machines, a future human species themselves, thought of themselves as the only worthy heirs to the Star People and made it their mission to destroy all others. The Sauros, after 80 million years in existence, were now gone, but thanks to the author of the story, they would not be forgotten. They would become the longest-lasting future human species of all those created by the Q.
The Bug Faces from C.M. Kozeman's All Tomorrows. One of only a few future human species to live out the entirety of the story, the Bug Faces began their existence, like all the others, as star people, galactic voyagers bred specifically for space travel and planetary colonization by Earth and Mars scientists. Following the devastating Q invasion of their homeworld, one group of star people was forcibly modified on a genetic level into a new species known as the Insectophagi. Their intelligence was removed and they were reduced to the level of lesser animals. The Insectophagi were named so by the mysterious alien author of the story for their diet consisting of insects. As a species, they weren't particularly special, and it was only through luck, chance, and a second alien invasion, of which no information is available, that they would manage to progress beyond their now primitive state. The Q had given them leathery faceplates to protect them against insect stings and bites, and they would scoop up their food with their long anteater-like tongues. They wouldn't stay like this forever though. In time, and following the previously mentioned second alien invasion, which possibly ended up with the Insectophagi being genetically altered once again, they would eventually evolve into a new form, the Bug Faces. Despite the Q's previous efforts, the Star People's DNA lay dormant in their cells, meaning that given enough time, a return to sentience was sure to take place. Because of this, one lineage, at some point in their history, developed something of a throwback with a larger brain than was typical of their species at the time. Their faces, as the name would suggest, look rather bug-like. Their hands and feet had become pincer-like, with only 3 digits on each hand and 2 toes on each foot, at least according to the illustration on the cover of the book. Throughout their history, the Bug Faces would go through all of the typical human developments, from farming, in their case insect hive farms, colonizing other territories on their world, an industrial revolution, and several world wars. They would eventually, for better or worse, become a globalized world. They would also become intensely xenophobic due to the alien invasion they were subjected to, and were fearful of even their post-human cousins on other worlds. When the other future humans did attempt to reach out to the Bug Faces to invite them into the interplanetary union known as the Second Galactic Empire, they were met with a cold reception. The Bug Faces were not keen on outsiders. But, with a little bit of coaxing and reassurance, the Bug Faces eventually would join the Second Galactic Empire, and it only took 60 million years for them to do so. They would spend a further 20 million years as members of the Empire, exchanging information and technological advancements with their brethren, and achieving unimaginable wonders. At long last, everything seemed to be going well for the Bug Faces. But nothing lasts forever. The rise of the Gravital and the Machine Empire spelled doom for the Second Galactic Empire. The Gravital were a future human race that had implanted their minds into machine bodies, and because of their technological prowess and the vast amount of ancient Star People ruins left on their world, they considered themselves the only worthy heirs to the Starmen. They would embark on a mission of mass genocide to wipe out the other future humans, who they considered unworthy. Every other species was now gone, and only the smallest traces of their existence remained. The Bug Faces, however, weren't entirely destroyed. The Gravital had allowed a small amount of Bug Faces to survive. They would be brought into the Machine Empire as slaves and pets. They would also, at the mechanical hands of the Gravital, be subjected to yet more genetic modifications so that they may perform better in their roles as servants and slaves. It was at this point that they would cease to be the Bug Faces and would become the Subjects. After a time within the cold, metallic grip of the Empire, the now Subjects would eventually begin to make strides towards being a recognized living being by the machines. Progress was slow at first. To begin with, only a small number of machines were sympathetic to their plight. But, as time passed, more and more of the Gravital would come around to this new way of thinking. It would eventually reach the point of the Subjects engaging in romantic relationships with the machines. This, of course, was rather taboo and very much frowned upon in machine society, at least to begin with. More time would pass and more subject-machine relationships would blossom, and this practice would begin to become more mainstream.
At this point, there was much infighting within the Machine Empire, which the subjects called their home. Different factions had emerged, with one side wanting full citizen status for the subjects within the Empire, and the other side refusing to recognize them as equals. All hell would break loose when the subject sympathizers began to campaign for a set of worlds to be designated as exclusive homes for organic life. This was seen as heresy among those who wished to keep the subjects as second-class citizens. To ease these tensions, a scapegoat was needed, and in what was perhaps the most moronic course of action the machine leaders could have taken, they chose the godlike Asteromorphs to be that scapegoat. The war between the machines and the Asteromorphs did not go in the machines' favour, and their empire was brought to ruin. The Asteromorphs, previously uninterested in the affairs of the other species and their organic cousins, now had no choice but to step in and help the subjects. The Asteromorphs were gods, and the subjects, now without the aid of their former machine masters, were once again a primitive people. But with the Asteromorph gods and the Asteromorph terrestrials guiding them, the subjects would begin, once again, the long road to civilization. Some would rebel or refuse to heed their masters, and were made extinct for it. But a new batch of subjects would be engineered and bred by the Asteros, and they would try again and again and again, until finally a stable subject population was brought into existence. No doubt, they would have gone on to make great achievements once they were ready to be left to their own devices. However, the details on this stage of their development are scarce. What ultimately happened to this race of bug-faced future humans is unknown, but their end is not what's important. From their humble beginnings as the insectophagi, their evolution into the bug-facers, their fending off an alien invasion, joining the Second Galactic Empire, and emerging as its sole survivors after the Gravital onslaught, to their unique relationships with the machines and their eventual place as the children of the Asteromorphs, theirs truly was a long, wonderful, and terrifying journey of existence. The Symbiotes from C.M. Kozeman's All Tomorrows are a future human race of people. Like all of the future humans that we meet in the book, the symbiote species began its journey as star people, intergalactic explorers who were eventually captured, conquered, and then genetically modified by an alien race known as the Q. As punishment for managing to turn back the Q's first attempt at invasion, the star people of one world were modified into something resembling the Australopithecus that lived on Earth in ancient times. Compared to other Q creations whose ancestors had managed to temporarily fend off the Q, this would seem at first to be a fairly light sentence. However, this was not the full extent of their punishment. A kind of human tick-like species known as the parasites were also created from the star people. There were a few different varieties, but the most common was about the size of a human fist, pictured here. The parasites would latch on to the new ape men and live off of them, sucking their blood for sustenance. This was all played out under the watchful and sadistic eye of the Q for an agonizing 40 million years, until they left. Because it was such a bizarre and artificial ecosystem that the hosts and parasites inhabited, which required constant maintenance from the Q, most of these life forms died out once their creators had gone, but not all of them perished, however. The survivors would once again begin the slow and painful evolutionary process. After a time, the host-parasite relationship would become less one-sided. Instead of a parasite merely attaching itself to a host and bleeding it dry, it would have evolved attributes that would provide the host with advantages it didn't possess before, making this a more cooperative arrangement. It would seem that by this point, the two could establish a sort of neural connection, and with a parasite attachment, the host would gain, for example, a second pair of eyes which would come in handy when on the lookout for predators. Other parasites could offer the hosts the ability to produce venomous saliva. In turn, the host offered the parasite a more mobile lifestyle and a stronger body rich with blood. This would continue over many millions of years until they reached the point where full sentience had developed. At this stage, the parasites could now offer the hosts the ability to think on a higher level in return for total submission. The parasites would become the pilots of the larger human bodies of the hosts, thus becoming the symbiotes. It began in a way much like a horse and its rider, where the parasite could control the host, which was still able to think for itself, using verbal commands and physical action. But after a few 100,000 years, the parasites would develop the ability to control the hosts like puppets, using a combination of olfactory and tactile signals. After a few more thousand years, the symbiotes would develop civilizations much like our own, with countries, politics, and of course, wars. The intelligent parasites would eventually develop technologies which would take care of much of their needs, but they didn't drop the hosts completely. Host husbandry was retained due to tradition and efficiency. The parasite side of the symbiosis would have a host for work, a host for leisurely pursuits, and probably others used for different activities. After much time, many millions of years, the symbiotes would learn of their history, piecing together what had happened many tens of millions of years before with the Q and the Star People. Like their cousins on other worlds, they would begin to try and reach out to them, broadcasting signals into space in the hope of someone picking them up. They did. The symbiotes would make contact with other future human species, who had by this point established the Second Galactic Empire. The symbiotes were among the third wave of species to join. The symbiotes would spend the next 20 million years as dutiful members of the Empire, and would have achieved things completely beyond our scope of imagination. But nothing lasts forever. After a staggering 80 million years, the symbiotes and the rest of the Empire came to a violent end at the hands of the maniacal species known as the Gravital. These were a species of future human that considered itself the only true heirs to the Star People, and took it upon themselves to wipe out all the others who they saw as inferior and unworthy. Such extinctions, however, were commonplace in the galaxy. They had lived lives just as human as our own, and achieved an untold number of accomplishments throughout their existence. But now the symbiotes were gone. Humanity, however, was not. The Pterosapiens, first introduced in 2006's All Tomorrows by C.M. Kozeman, are a post-human species designed and bred by the Q using Star People as the base genome. They were first genetically modified into a form known simply as the Flyers, and they were one of many human-derived flying species that the Q created. Quite why the Q decided to create flying humans is unknown. We do know, however, that the Q were fond of keeping pets, as is the case with the hedonists. It's possible that flying pets were also popular among them, and with the Q also having the ability to fly, one can imagine a Q taking its pet flyer out for a fly, similar to how we humans take our dogs out for a walk. Perhaps the Q would wrap its long tail around the flyer's neck and guide it around in mid-air. While many of the flying species which were created never regained their human intelligence and instead lapsed into a permanently bestial state, one variation would eventually evolve to become highly advanced and become the dominant species on its planet. It is said to be monkey-like, and could fly using wing membranes which were stretched across its last 2 fingers. Once the Q had left their world, this particular type of flyer was able to become the master of its domain due to its having a uniquely shaped heart, said to be starfish-shaped, which again was specially designed by the Q. This artificially created heart was made so that it could pump blood to all of its extremities, those being its head, wings and legs, in rapid succession, meaning that it wouldn't need to devote the majority of its energy to either just its ability to think or its ability to fly. It could have both. With this advantage over the other flying species on their world, they would begin the slow and painful journey of evolution once again. They evolved into a wading, stork-like species of predator, of which no illustration is provided, before going through many more changes. They eventually became the species known as the Pterosapiens. Theirs was a truly unique civilization, one of fantastic sky cities with fluting buildings that stretched up into the heavens, lined with perches. The ground below would likely have been overgrown and wild, with the civilized world taking place miles above. The Pterosapiens had little use for land. By this point, theirs was a truly enlightened society, one that boasted some of the greatest philosophers and thinkers of all the human-derived species. Their brains were enormous, and they put them to good use. The scrolls and written works produced by the Pterosapiens would have been the envy of all of humankind's greatest philosophers. Aristotle, Confucius, Nietzsche, none of them had anything on the Pterosapiens. This species, unique in its ability to fly, had never really become a territorial one in the way that humans and their descendants on other planets had been. Travel had never been an issue for them, as they could simply fly to wherever they wanted to go, and as such, countries with real boundaries had never been formed. Cultural differences never really had a chance to come about, as the Pterosapiens were far too mobile, and the exchange of information with others from across the globe had always taken place, even in their earliest stages of development. They had never been isolated in any way, and so unlike most intelligent civilizations in which tribes come first, followed by city-states, and then countries which join together, ultimately resulting in globalization, the Pterosapiens planet had bypassed all of this, having always been a globalized world right from the start. Theirs was a fast-paced world unlike anything we 21st century humans have ever seen, and the Pterosapiens likely never even had any need for vehicles. They could fly wherever they wanted to go. One can imagine what life on their world would have been like, high up in the clouds where their miles-high cities would be at their busiest, Pterosapien individuals racing past you through the air at breakneck speed, going to work and living their lives. And the Pterosapiens' world was a fast-paced one for good reason. Though their starfish-shaped hearts were immensely powerful and able to pump blood to a set of wings and a large brain at the same time, it was also an imperfect, artificial design. As such, the Pteros were susceptible to severe heart conditions, and their lives were incredibly short by our standards. They were usually dead by the age of 23. It was because of this that they cherished every moment of their lives, for they knew that it would not last long at all. This didn't prevent them from achieving great things, however. They progressed and advanced themselves for millions of years, eventually joining the Second Galactic Empire, a federation of worlds inhabited by other Q-created future humans. They would likely have eventually solved their health problems, perhaps with the help of the future humans on the other worlds, as theirs was an empire of peace and immense shared technological advancement. All was well for tens of millions of years until, like all members of the SGE save for a few bug faces, they were wiped out by the insane Gravital, a race of former ruin haunters, another Q creation, who transformed themselves into machines to cope with the heat of the expanding sun that their planet revolved around. The Gravital were deluded, and were hell-bent on destroying all other future human species, as they fanatically considered themselves to be the only true heirs to the long-gone Star People. The Pteros were annihilated, as a part of one of the greatest acts of genocide the galaxy had ever seen. However, they had truly made the most of their short lives, and had achieved great things. But, like all species, their end eventually came. The Tool Breeders, first introduced in C.M. Kozeman's 2006 book All Tomorrows, are an aquatic, post-human race. Like all of the post-humans that we meet in the book, the Tool Breeders began life as Star People, who were genetically engineered by Earth and Mars scientists somewhere around the 31st century, after a cataclysmic war between the two planets which almost brought the human race to extinction. To ensure true unity going forward, and that such a war would never happen again, the Star People were created and, possessing heightened skills, intellect and capabilities, would head out into the galaxy to explore, colonize and terraform new planets so that mankind may live on. The future of the species seemed secure. That was until the Star People made contact with an intelligent alien race for the first time. It was not a peaceful encounter. The Q, a race more than 1 billion years old, were insane religious zealots who saw it as their divine right to rule the galaxy, and having long since mastered genetic engineering, were able to change any life forms that they came across into anything that they wanted them to be. The Star People were wiped out in less than 1,000 years by the invading Q menace, and in their place were left an unknown number of strange creatures created by the Q from harvested human DNA. The Q eventually left them behind, and they began the slow and painful evolutionary process once again. On one planet, the Star People who had once lived there were gone, but a human-derived ocean dweller was left in its place. These beings are known simply as the Swimmers. The Swimmers were not the only aquatic life forms that the Q created from the Star People, and it is stated in the book that all other forms, such as the limbless, ribbon-like eel people and the enormous human whales, went extinct once the Q disappeared. The Swimmers managed to survive, however, by feeding on fish and crustaceans which had been imported from Earth many thousands of years ago. In appearance, the Swimmers look like a sort of strange human-shark hybrid. They still possess very human-like eyes which are protected by blubbery eyelids. Their nose looks somewhat human, and their mouths seem to sit in a natural grin, which also echoes their human past. They have sharp, shark-like teeth, some of the top row being visible when their mouths are closed, and their necks are very wide yet seem to still resemble that of a vertebrate, meaning that they would have been able to use their heads to look around independently of the rest of their torso, unlike sharks, whales, and dolphins. Their flippers, upon first glance, look very much like that of an aquatic mammal, but upon closer inspection it can be seen that human-like hands lie just beneath the surface. They possess a dorsal fin which would aid in their lives underwater and provide them with stability and balance. What were once human legs are now a pair of tail fins, eerily similar to that of an Earth shark. It makes one wonder whether the Q had once visited Earth many tens of millions of years ago and are responsible for the creation of the sharks native to our planet. The resemblance is quite strong. It is stated in the book that the Swimmers were able to speak to each other, but they were unable to understand each other. This would have made for a lonely and isolated life in the dark, murky ocean depths of this far-flung planet. The Swimmers were the most successful predators on their planet, and so they would dominate the oceans for hundreds of thousands of years, slowly changing and evolving on their own and, like their cousins on other former Star People worlds, eventually re-evolved their intelligence and self-awareness. They would become a race known as the Tool Breeders. The Tool Breeders were an intelligent, sapient race, resembling a human-dolphin hybrid. Theirs was one of the most advanced of all future human societies, and their achievements in genetic engineering were perhaps rivaled only by the Q. Because the Tool Breeders were an aquatic life form, the use of fire, the cornerstone of industrial engineering, was not a possibility. Instead, they began to create the tools and equipment that they needed out of other living organisms that shared their underwater habitat. It started early on with the domestication of sea life, which runs parallel to the domestication of wolves and other animals by their Homo sapiens ancestors. They would use the sea life in their vicinity for hunting and tracing purposes, before progressing over the millennia to the point where they had achieved the ability to genetically engineer any and all life forms to whim, for any purpose that they so desired. Eventually, they reached the point where all of their tools were organic life forms, and they lived within living cities made from heart-like creatures that would pump out nutrients to a network of self-repairing living conduits, their underwater equivalent of a power grid. Theirs was an infrastructure that was made up entirely of genetically modified living creatures. The Tool Breeders' homes were large exoskeletal beasts, which used their bioluminescence to provide them with a light source. They had medicinal sea squirts and flickering cephalopod skin televisual devices, among many other devices which were alive and relied on the power grid which fed them liquid nutrients. Eventually they reached a point where they had achieved a complete mastery of genetic engineering. At this point they did not even need to use living creatures, as they could now simply use and manipulate a single small tissue culture sample or a few stem cells to solve any problem that they may have encountered. The Tool Breeders were now the undisputed dominant life forms on their ocean world, and with this came their all too human desire for further expansion. Once they had achieved all that they could on their planet, it was time to look to the stars for more water worlds to colonize. This they did, and they spent many millions of years spreading throughout the galaxy. Eventually they made contact with other future human species, their distant cousins on other worlds who were also now highly evolved, after being modified into the equivalents of cavemen or animals by the Q. These were the Satyriacs and the Killerfolk, who had, a few thousand years before, established a second galactic empire. Using living radio arrays, the Tool Breeders were able to initiate contact and were then free to join the new empire, of which several other future human species would join over the ensuing tens of millions of years. Within this time, the Tool Breeders, along with their fellow members of the Empire, made advances and achievements that would be unimaginable and incomprehensible to even the brightest minds of the 21st century. However, all good things must eventually come to an end. The Tool Breeders, along with all other members of the Empire, were in the end wiped out by the Gravital, a race of former humans turned machines, descended from another Q creation named the Ruin Haunters, who held the insane belief that they were the only true heirs to the Star People, and took it upon themselves to wipe out all other species. In the end, the Tool Breeders, like all other lifeforms to have ever existed or ever will exist, became extinct, but they had used their time wisely and, despite living beneath the ocean waves, lived lives just as human as the ones we live today. And so ends one of the most incredible and alien journeys ever to be undertaken by a human lineage. The Sail People from CM Kozeman's All Tomorrows are the evolved form of the Fingerfishers, genetically modified star people created by the Q. In their early Fingerfisher form, they were a peaceful pescatorial animal, not yet possessing sentience. They lived on an archipelago world. Whether this was the world the Q found these star people on originally, or whether they were transported there shortly before or after their transformation, is unknown. The book seems to indicate that their hooked fingers evolved independently of the Q's meddling, as it states that their elongated fingers became ambulatory fish hooks, meaning that while the Q had made the Star People's fingers longer than they were originally, the hooks themselves had evolved on their own after these feral beings learned to pluck fish from the waterways of their world. Their teeth, again, seem to have become needle-like for eating fish, and were originally modified by the Q for a generalized diet, meaning that our first look at the Fingerfisher is of one that has evolved from what the Q originally made. What this previous form or forms looked like is unknown. Later on, much later on, the Fingerfishers would evolve into a wide variety of new forms. This was due to their world's many islands and continents being so scattered around the planet, meaning that perhaps hundreds of thousands of differing cultures would develop, more or less isolated from one another. This would mean that, once contact was established, the differences were such that constant conflicts and wars were basically guaranteed. Of all the forms of Fingerfisher to call this world their home, one lineage would eventually re-evolve sentience. They would become the Sail People. The Sail People were named for their wing-like appendages, used not for flight, though some of their distant relatives did take to the sky, but for propelling themselves across their planet's innumerable waterways and oceans. Their elongated snouts grew longer still, coming to resemble a rather crocodilian form. Their tongues became ambulatory and were used as hands, as can be seen in the book's illustration, in which the individual in the background is shown grasping a harpoon while out hunting on the open water. The Sail People are said to be extremely violent by nature, in stark contrast to their peaceful Fingerfisher ancestors. This was most likely out of necessity, as their laid-back way of life would not guarantee them a safe place in the species' future. Due to the sheer number of differing cultures on the Sail People's world, it would take thousands and thousands of years for them to truly unite. but when they did achieve world peace, they would begin to look to the stars above, embarking on missions of exploration. It was through this that they would, like all of the other now sentient future humans, discover the remnants and ruins of the bygone star people and the Q, and finally manage to piece together their true history. After this, they theorized that there would likely be others out there amongst the stars with the same origins, and so they began to broadcast radio communications out into the cosmos, hoping for a response. And luckily, a response was forthcoming. They made contact with others and would eventually join the Second Galactic Empire, a political union of several worlds inhabited by other future humans. For almost 80 million years, a truly incomprehensible amount of time, the Sail people and the Second Galactic Empire would exchange information, technologies and experiences, achieving a level of greatness that we 21st century humans couldn't even imagine. But, as all things do, the Empire came to an end, in its case a violent and horrifying one, at the hands of the mechanical race, the Gravital. The Gravital were future humans who had put their minds into machines and considered themselves the only race worthy of the ancient star people's legacy. The Gravital blocked out the suns of the Empire's worlds, blanketing them in freezing darkness and destroying all of the world's inhabitants. The Sail people were now gone, but they would not be forgotten, thanks to the tireless work of the unknown alien author. The Killer Folk, first introduced in C.M. Kozeman's 2006 book All Tomorrows, are a future human race of people who came about as a result of genetic engineering perpetrated by the book's main antagonists, the Q. The Killer Folk began life as star people, genetically engineered humans who were created by Earth and Mars scientists in the 31st century, following a bloody interstellar war between the two planets. After some time, the star people had colonized countless planets throughout the Milky Way galaxy, and theirs was a galactic society of true progress. However, after coming into contact with the malevolent Q and being conquered by them, they were imprisoned and genetically engineered into a great many baffling new forms. This was the Q's mission, to remake the universe and all life forms within it. The result of this on one planet was two new forms, named in the book simply as the Predators and the Prey. While the prey were designed to be herbivorous grazers like the antelopes of old Earth, the predators were made to be exactly what their name suggested. While there were a few different forms of predators, many said to resemble the vampires and goblins of old Earth folklore, the most common and successful variation of human predator had modified fingers and thumbs with razor-sharp claws, which they would use to tear their prey apart. They had gaping jaws and sharp teeth and large sensitive ears, which made them the most efficient predators on the planet. They had all the attributes of the mammalian predators of old Earth, including a strong, lean yet muscular frame, and they seemed to be covered in a short fur, with a spotted pattern running from the tops of their heads all the way down their backs, similar to leopards and cheetahs. Their eyes, it should be noted, still seem remarkably human, as do their noses. They are described also as having disproportionate heads, meaning that they still possessed large brains which would help them in re-evolving their human intelligence further down the line. These predators, judging by the timeline at the beginning of the book, eventually hunted the prey into extinction, as the prey did not, as far as we know, have any descendants by the time the intelligent killerfolk had come into being. Or it could be that the prey had simply devolved even further by this point, and were not even recognizably human, instead resembling something more like a farm animal, hence their not getting a mention at this point in the timeline. The human predators had now evolved to become the killerfolk. By this point, the killerfolk had lost much of their primitive apparatus used for hunting and killing, such as their saber teeth and razor-sharp claws. They still persisted in a small way, but had now shrunken down and become fragile, and were now only used as indications of status. They were no longer really useful as weapons, much like the canines of a 21st century human. They still, however, seem to possess short fur on parts of their bodies, as can be seen in the illustration which shows a young male member of this race exploring ancient ruins on his planet. The fur and cheetah-like spotted pattern is still still present on his neck and probably down his back as well. It seems as though the fur has since disappeared from their hands, arms and much of the face, however, and a head of human-like hair now persists thanks to their human DNA, which lay dormant for countless millennia, finally re-emerging during the course of their evolution. The killer folk, despite becoming fully sentient, were still quite in tune with their killer instincts. They were still much stronger than the Homo sapiens of their distant ancestry, and it would seem that every individual had the ability and the constitution to quickly and easily kill others, but as they were no longer primitives, they would only do so if they really wanted to and if the circumstances allowed for it. While bare-handed murder was possible, the killer folk at this point seemed to prefer the use of weapons such as bows and arrows or powerful gas rifles. Throughout their history, the killer folk had naturally developed many religions, the majority of which had rituals involving killing and allowed for sacred periods of hunting one another and engaging in duels to the death. On the whole, these were civilized and orderly communities which would, at specific and designated times, erupt into orgies of death, perhaps similar to the Purge series of films. This gave rise to so-called hunter nobilities, who were privileged warriors skilled in the art of killing. The hunting of others was of such importance to the killer folk throughout most of their history that it can be theorized that their civilizations would have had many parallels with the fictional Yautja, also known as predators, from the popular science fiction Predator films. The Yautja have strict codes of honor and hunt to prove their worth to others of their kind, and also take trophies from their kills. It could be that the killer folk and the Yautja at one point were quite similar. All of this would persist from their earliest civilizations up until the point where they underwent an industrial revolution, in which factory farming was established in some regions, thus further removing the killer folk from their murderous ways. It could be theorized that the industrial factory farming practices came much later in their development than in their 21st century human ancestors, as hunting and killing was of such psychological importance to them. While some regions began using factory farming as their means of attaining meat products, some countries wanted to keep alive the traditions of hunting and killing, and the resulting tensions between those who wished to move on from their old ways and those who believed it was their right to practice these acts of death almost resulted in a cataclysmic global conflict, which they were, luckily, able to avoid. The killer folk, it seemed, then progressed and continued to live and thrive for tens of millions of years and, along with the Satyriacs, who they had managed to contact after broadcasting radio communications into space in their search for other life forms, founded the Second Galactic Empire. At some point during this time, the killer folk had learned all about their ancestral roots and what the Q had done to the Star People many millions of years ago. Several other future human species would eventually join the Empire, and it would be a long and prosperous venture lasting tens of millions of years, in which the peoples of all these distant worlds would exchange information and experiences, and would forge a unity that spanned many millions of light years of distance, all standing together and all being at the ready for the next alien invasion. No alien invasion ever came, however. Ironically, it would be another future human race that would bring about the end of the killer folk and the Second Galactic Empire. The Gravital, future humans now in machine form, would destroy all worlds with organic life, believing themselves to be the only true heirs to the Star People. While most worlds were killed off by the Gravital using great sails millions of miles wide to block out their suns, an illustration in the book shows that the killer folk's homeworld was invaded directly. One theory is that the killer folk had gotten wind of the coming invasion from one of their allied worlds within the Empire, and were able to disable the Gravital's sun sail before it could be fully activated. With this, it may have necessitated a head-on assault by the Gravital. The killer folk were still made extinct by the Gravital, but their unique social profile as historic killers may have given them more of an edge in matters of war, meaning that they didn't succumb to the Gravital invasion as quickly as some of the other future human worlds. The killer folk had met their end, as all species eventually do, but they had lived their lives and survived for millions and millions of years, and while they were now gone, organic life would still continue in other parts of the galaxy. The Snake People, as a species, are a post-human race first introduced in C.M. Kozeman's 2006 book, All Tomorrows. The Snake People, like all other in-universe future humans, are a result of genetic engineering by the maniacal alien race known as the Q, galactic nomads who would travel between galaxies and genetically modify all life forms that they came across. The Snake People began their lives as Star People, who, after a catastrophic encounter with the Q, were captured, imprisoned, and genetically modified. The end result of this genetic meddling on this particular world was the worms. The worms are the first of the post-human species that we meet in the book. Perhaps one of the more bizarre-looking species of future human, they have been given, as the name would suggest, a worm-like appearance and are described as being around the same length as a traditional human's arm. Their hands and feet have been retained but modified for their new lives underground. The worms' human intelligence was removed and they were reduced to the level of animals, who did very little except dig around looking for food and mating with each other. They had tiny eyes and their ears and teeth were removed, along with half of their nervous system. Their physical form was simplified for a life underground. Quite why the Q had decided to do this in particular to the Star People is unknown. The worms needed to live underground, as it would seem that the Q not only modified their physical bodies, but they also modified the atmosphere of their planet. This new world revolved around a scorching sun, and with the book mentioning that this had been made worse by Q intervention, it can be assumed that the Q, by way of their immense technological prowess, had the ability to either change the atmospheric composition of planets, or, even more terrifyingly, they had the ability to change the overall mass of suns. Did the Q change the planet's atmosphere, or did they change the planet's sun? Both seem well within the capabilities of the Q. With the surface of their planet being comparable to an oven, and covered with the ruins of their former cities that baked in the extreme heat, the worms began their new lives underground. The worms, like all living things, then began to change and evolve over hundreds of thousands of years after the Q left. After a time, it seems that their planet cooled, perhaps due to its atmosphere growing thinner over time. The worms' descendants, a variety of serpent-like mammals, rose to the surface and evolved into snake-like grazers, swimmers, and also predators. They were able to fill every niche that had been vacant for countless millennia, and one lineage would evolve to become the most intelligent and sentient species on the planet, the Snake People. After over 1 million years, the Snake People came into being and had all the hallmarks of intelligent humans. They had their own unique cultures, architecture, language, and technology. Their physiology is how they were given their name. They had long serpentine bodies and elongated faces like the snakes on old Earth. They seemed to have whiskers on the sides of their heads, betraying their mammalian biology. They have ears, re-evolved after being taken away by the Q all those hundreds of thousands of years ago. Their approximate size is not known, but with their ancestors, the worms, being around the size of a Homo sapiens arm, it can be assumed that the Snake People would be slightly longer than this to accommodate a larger, more evolved brain, so an approximate length of 4 to 5 or perhaps even 6 feet long can be estimated. At the end of their snake-like bodies, they have a somewhat human-looking hand with 4 digits, which is prehensile and able to use and manipulate objects. Judging by the small feet of their ancestors, the worms, it would appear that this 4-fingered hand is the result of the worm's little feet fusing together over time. With this particular lineage being descended from tree climbers, it can be theorized that they would have used these hands at the ends of their bodies to hang from branches, upside down in a bat-like fashion, and also for climbing. It could be that they would hold onto a branch with their single hand and swing back to gain momentum, before letting go of the branch and catapulting themselves forward towards their target branch or prey item. The illustrated example shown in the book presents a civilized snake person wearing clothing, living inside of a building and enjoying a book while smoking and listening to vibrational ground music. The Snake People clearly enjoyed rest and relaxation as much as anyone else and seemed to be at their happiest when indoors. Their evolutionary path, being descended from tree climbers, meant that they were much more comfortable in enclosed spaces, and the designs of their cities were testament to this fact. Their pastime of enjoying vibrational ground music could mean that they do not have eardrums like their human ancestors did, and instead have inner ear structures similar to Earth snakes, which allows them to feel vibrations through their jaws, or in the highly evolved snake person's case, through their entire bodies. Or it could be that they have both eardrums and the necessary biological apparatus to hear through vibrations as well. A notable feature of the Snake People's anatomy is their spirally coiled brains. Despite the unusual shape of the Snake People's brains, it did not hinder them in any way, as they were an advanced and highly evolved species. The cities of the Snake People people were designed in such a way that accommodated their need to be enclosed within confined areas for safety, and were designed as narrow, twisting and winding tunnels and pipes, which would lead into what are described as windowless, hole-like buildings. Their settlements as a whole looked like giant balls of glass, metal, plastic and cloth, and were wound tightly like enormous balls of yarn, and would be impossible for anything other than a snake person or other serpentine creature to move around in. As bizarre as their lifestyle may seem to us, it was perfectly normal to them, and our lifestyle of walking around in the open and having windows in our houses would seem like absolute madness to them. They had achieved human-like intelligence once again after being reduced to the level of beasts by the Q, and lived lives filled with all the usual human emotions, sadness, joy, anger. They were capable of them all. They read and wrote books, philosophized, created beautiful works of vibrational music, and progressed into an advanced civilization, and eventually they would, along with many of their post-human cousins on distant worlds, become members of the Second Galactic Empire. The members of this empire all inhabited planets too far from one another to actually meet in person, but they would communicate and exchange technological information and innovations via radio waves, and forge an alliance with these other species which lasted for tens of millions of years. In the communications the snake people undertook with the other members of the empire, they covered every subject imaginable in their exchanges of information and experience, but the two main issues they held dear were political unification and galactic awareness. Having found the ruins of the Star People and the Q during their voyages across the heavens, and learning all about their ancestry and what took place during the Q invasion, nobody wanted a repeat of those events, and so they were all joined in unity and were always stood at the ready waiting for the next alien invasion to come along. The tragedy in all of this, however, lies in the fact that it was not an alien invasion that brought about the end of the Snake People and the rest of the Second Galactic Empire, but an invasion from another post-human species. The Gravital were a race of machines, formerly Q-created ruin haunters who had modified themselves genetically and developed a way to install their minds into mechanical forms after their sun expanded and made life as an organic unbearable. This race had always shunned the Second Galactic Empire and all other future human species, believing themselves to be the true heirs to the Star People. After several million years, the Gravital set about committing the worst genocide the galaxy had ever seen, and went about all future human planets, annihilating the life forms who inhabited them. Along with the Satyriacs, the Tool Breeders, and the Pterosapiens, among others, the Snake People were wiped out during the Gravital invasion. The species was now sadly extinct, but this extinction-level event was not an unusual occurrence within the galaxy. The Snake People had made great advances, had become a Type 3 civilization, and had lived lives just as human as the ones we live now. After all that they had done, all that they had accomplished, the Snake People's time was over, and had come to its natural conclusion.
The Satyriacs from C.M. Kozeman's All Tomorrows are a post-human race. They are distinguished physically by their elongated snouts and dinosaur-like postures. The Satyriacs are descended from a species known as the Hedonists. The Hedonists were created, like all other future humans, by the alien race known as the Q. The Q did this by genetically modifying the Star People, who themselves were created by Earth and Mars scientists to go forth and colonize the galaxy. The Q changed the Star People into a myriad of strange forms, seeing themselves as godlike creators, and one of these forms was the Hedonists. The Hedonists were bred to be pets, and they lived lives of incredible luxury on a lush tropical world, where their every need and all of their wants and desires were fulfilled. Ordinarily, a species like the Hedonists would quickly crowd out its environment, as there were no predators, and also the Hedonists had no need to compete with one another, as there was plenty of food to go around. And also, the Q had modified them so that they could only reproduce after mating many times, so pregnancy was rather uncommon. But when the Q suddenly left after spending many millions of years watching over them, evolution would begin once again. It would begin with an era of geologic upheavals, upon which a great many new islands would rise from beneath the ocean's surface. Until then, the Hedonists had been trapped on a singular island about the size of Iceland,
But with these new islands now within reach, the hedonists quickly began to expand and colonize them. These events had also thrown up enormous ash clouds, and the majority of the innocent hedonists would die out, unable to adapt to a world which now demanded that they work hard for their survival. A small amount would survive, however. These were individuals that were capable of breeding much quicker than the average hedonist, abnormalities which would prove to be the key to their species' future. They would continue to breed for hundreds of thousands of years, giving rise to several new species. One of these would become the Satyriacs. As stated before, the Satyriacs possess elongated faces and a dinosaurian posture. They have long tails, which were boneless and were there for balance. They also now possessed intelligence and had become fully sentient. Much like their ancestors, they lived lives in pursuit of all pleasures. Pleasure-seeking was an integral part of their cultural identity, and each working week was punctuated with concerts, festivals, orgies, and all manner of enjoyable events. They never denied themselves the good things that life had to offer, and it seemed that this attitude would serve them well, as their species would last for tens of millions of years. Their striking appearance and unique worldview would make the Satyriacs perhaps one of the most popular species among fans of the All Tomorrows mythos. After several millions of years, the Satyriacs had gone the same route as all of the other successful post-human species, and had colonized other worlds and discovered their true history as starmen who were conquered by the Q. They theorized that there may be others like them out there, and so they began to broadcast radio signals into the cosmos, hoping to reach others who may be out there. At some point, the Satyriacs would make contact with another species known as the Killer Folk. With this, they would found a union together called the Second Galactic Empire, a union which other future human species would eventually join. For 80 million years the Empire thrived, until it was destroyed by the Gravital, a race of machines that were descended from another post-human Q creation. The Machine Empire wiped out the Satyriacs along with most of the other post-humans, as they mistakenly believed themselves to be the ancient star people's true heirs. With this came the end of the Satyriacs. They had achieved much in their more than 80 million years in existence, but in less than 1,000 years, they were wiped out without a trace.
The Asteromorphs, first introduced in C.M. Kozeman's 2006 book All Tomorrows, are a race of hyper-advanced godlike beings. They first began life, like all of the post-human species, as star people, created by Earth and Mars scientists following their devastating interplanetary war somewhere around the 31st century. After colonizing and populating much of the Milky Way galaxy, the star people came into contact with the insane alien race known as the Q, who traveled the cosmos and genetically modified all life forms they came across in some bizarre religious mission. While many star people did succumb to the Q invasion, meeting with a terrible fate, a small number managed to evade them and find refuge. They piled into generation ships, old forms of technology used in the first failed attempts at colonization, and frantically headed out into the void of space. These generation ships had been the cause of much disaster in the past, as life on board was a bleak and unpleasant existence, causing many past communities to lapse into anarchy. But escaping the Q was a matter of life and, if they were lucky, death. They had no choice at this point but to endure a difficult and miserable existence on the generation ships, for the alternative was much worse. After travelling through the void for some time, the escapee star people began to find and confiscate entire asteroid fields. Living permanently on generation ships wasn't an option, and so they began using their advanced technologies to hollow out asteroids, in which they would make their new homes. These now hollow asteroids were made into Titanic spaceships, and they were filled up with precious artificially created oxygen and water to support life. There was, however, no gravity, which would become the main factor in these star people's unique path of evolution over the next several million years. Inside their moon-sized havens with no gravity and now safe from the invading Q, these interstellar exiles began to slowly adapt and change through a combination of evolution and genetic engineering. There was no gravity to hold them down, as it were, and so their bones over time began to lengthen and become
thinner, more spindly, and the weightlessness of their new existence meant that they developed a new way of propelling themselves from one point to another. They expelled jets of air from their anuses. Whether this was a product of evolution or genetic engineering is unknown. While these developments to their physical forms may seem incredible, they had still only really begun their journey. By this point, the Star People had evolved to become the Spacers, who had now diverged considerably from their terrestrial ancestors. It was now impossible for them to live anywhere with gravity, and this would cause an immense disconnect from their cousins on other worlds, as we'll see later on. After many more millions of years, the many hollowed-out asteroid ship space arcs had been joined and interlocked to create an enormous new world populated by beings who had by now mastered the void of space. These were the Asteromorphs. Free from the confines of gravity, their fingers could grow extremely long and versatile, each becoming a fully independent limb, and their brains could grow to incredible sizes, as weight was no longer a problem when they spent their entire lives floating in zero gravity. They also still retained their jet-like anuses that had become their primary mode of propulsion. The Asteromorphs were arguably the most intelligent beings to have ever existed in the galaxy, and would go through their daily lives thinking in concepts inconceivable to even the brightest minds of the 21st century. The Asteromorphs, despite their mind-blowing level of advancement, still retained some traits of their ancient human ancestors, still possessing the desire to expand their empire and spread their society as far and wide as they could. To do this, they built huge globular sub-arcs which they used to go forth and find new territories to colonize. They did not, however, have any interest in colonizing planets. Terrestrial planets were no longer conducive to their lifestyle, as they required zero-gravity environments in which to live and thrive. It would seem that the Asteromorphs would either make these gigantic globular sub-arcs their homes, which they would spread across the galaxy, or that they would find new asteroid fields in which they would, like the Star People before them, hollow out the asteroids and transform them into space arcs. The Asteromorphs made their homes in the heavens above the planets, not on the planets themselves. They had no real interest in the comings and goings of the inhabitants on these planets either, who were also descended from the Q-created abominations. Evolutionarily, the Asteromorphs had left all others in the dust. They would watch the other future humans curiously, from a distance, but they wouldn't get involved in their affairs. Sitting above the clouds, watching the terrestrial lifeforms go about their business without intervention and possessing technological advances of an unimaginable scale meant that the Asteromorphs had truly emerged as gods. They remained this way for countless millions of years, virtually unparalleled in their corporeal existence by any other species, apart from one, the Gravital, machines, former ruin haunters who had changed themselves from organic to mechanic after the expansion of their sun made life too uncomfortable. They were also a highly advanced race with an empire that stretched across an untold number of worlds. The two empires had, throughout countless ages, kept a close eye on each other, each believing that their counterpart was waiting for an opportunity to strike. They both knew that a war would be equally catastrophic for both empires, and this knowledge kept everyone at bay for a very long time. However, due to inner conflict within the Machine Empire, a scapegoat was needed to unite the machines and, more importantly, distract its citizens from the problems within their own society. Those in charge of the Machine Empire, in an act of complete lunacy, chose the Asteromorph Empire to be that scapegoat. They spent a staggering 50 million years at war with one another, with countless casualties being suffered on both sides. In the end, however, the Asteromorphs, who had changed and evolved even more since the early days of the war, were triumphant. After this war was finally over, the Asteromorphs had planned to destroy every last machine, only to realize that they were too useful as tools to be completely gotten rid of. They decided instead to modify them so that they would never again become a threat to organic life, changing their programming to dull their imaginations, and then integrated them into the new United Galaxies Empire. The
The Asteromorphs were now vastly different in appearance. They still retained their long spindly digits derived from the fingers of their ancient ancestors, which had now formed a series of legs and sails to help with gliding through zero gravity. But now their enormous, bulging brains had spread outwards from the sides of their heads, resembling wings. It was at this point that the Asteromorphs finally began to engage with the other organics of the galaxy, their distant cousins, the Subjects, who had been kept as pets by members of the Machine Empire. The Subjects were rescued and their genetics were used to populate entire planets. By this point, the Asteromorphs had decided that they wanted to be actual gods ruling over lower life forms, as they then created from themselves a new form of Asteromorph known as the Terrestrials, who had been heavily modified physically for life on the planets they ruled. Their brains were shrunken down and their limbs were changed into spidery legs for walking. They acted as gods on the worlds of the organics that they watched over, governing them and taking care of them in all ways to help them on their course. This didn't always work out, however, and many times the Subjects on these planets rebelled against the Terrestrials, refusing to heed them. This was always punished with extinction, at which point the Terrestrials would create new life from the Subjects' DNA and try again. These Terrestrials sometimes became corrupt, and rather than helping these new human societies on their way to advancement, they would simply play God and create religions around themselves, forcing the Subjects to worship them. As counterproductive as this may seem, however, it seemed to be the most effective method of instilling calm in the Subjects and creating peaceful societies. The Asteromorphs also, after many more millions of years, re-encountered the nefarious Q and defeated them. While it is probable that the Asteromorphs then spent several more millions of years nurturing their organic creations and guiding them to become Type 2 and then Type 3 civilizations, the ultimate fate of the Asteromorphs, as stated by the book's alien author a billion years after the events, is not known.
The Second Galactic Empire from C.M. Kozeman's All Tomorrows was a political union made up of several worlds which were populated by varying species of future human who, by the point of their induction into the Empire, were far in advance of us 21st century humans in every way imaginable. All of these species were the descendants of Q creations, former star people who were conquered and then genetically modified. The name Second Galactic Empire presumably comes from the idea of the original star people who had ventured out into the void to colonize the galaxy tens of millions of years before them, being thought of as the First Galactic Empire. It is unknown whether the member worlds of the Second Galactic Empire referred to their interstellar political union by this name, or if it was in fact a name coined by the alien author who was revealed to be the one who chronicled humanity's journey at the end of the book. It would seem more likely that Second Galactic Empire was a name that the author came up with. It is also unknown just how many worlds made up the Empire. We know how many species it was made up of, 11 by the time the Empire was fully formed, but quite how many planets and moons each of these species had colonized during their lifetimes before joining together as one can only be guessed at. The book states that each race had colonized a few dozen each. The Empire is said to have begun when the Killerfolk and the Satyriacs managed to reach each other via radio communication. Upon traversing deep space and coming across the ruins of the bygone star people, these two species had begun to theorize that there may be others like them out there, and so they got to work on broadcasting signals into space which they hoped would be picked up by someone. They were. A dialogue was established between these two peoples, and they would begin to exchange all of the information they had, presumably after deciphering each other's languages. About 1,000 years after these two races began their dialogue, they would be joined by an aquatic future human species, again descended from the star people, known as the Tool Breeders. A further 10 million years would pass before a second wave of sentient species would join. These were the Pterosapiens, the Asymmetrics, and the Modular people. The third wave would arrive over the next 20 million years, these being the Saurosapients, the Snake people, the Sail people, and the Symbiotes, all of whom had explored the galaxy, discovered the remains of the Star People civilizations and their conflicts with the Q, made the necessary connections, and then broadcast radio communications in hopes of contacting others like themselves. And finally, after 40 million years, the bug facers joined the Empire as well, initially hesitant to do so due to their xenophobic nature. They had been subjected to an alien invasion at some point in their history, and so it would take them a little bit longer to open up to the other future humans. With all of the member races together at last, the Empire would become one of constant communication, exchanging information on everything that they could. The Empire would eventually come across the Asteromorphs. They feared a repeat of what had happened millions of years before with the Q, as the Asteromorphs seemed mysterious, alien, and frightening to them. However, luckily, the Asteromorphs had no interest in the Empire or its worlds. They were given a wide berth, and no conflict would ever arise between them. The Second Galactic Empire would last for 80 million years. It is unlikely that any of the species would still resemble the illustrations we are shown even a few million years into their empire's lifetime. However, we never get to see the more advanced forms of most of them. During its heyday, the Empire's citizens had attained an unimaginable standard of living. It was an empire of peace, with each species living to the fullest potential of its existence, achieving wonders. But with all of these future human species coming together and creating a utopian existence for themselves, there was one race that refused to join in, a race that considered itself superior to all others, despite having much the same history and origin. It was this race that would bring about the end of the Second Galactic Empire, the Gravital. They began their lineage as a humanoid race known as the Ruin Haunters, a Q creation like all the others. But the Ruin Haunters' world remained littered with ancient Q and Star People technology, giving them a head start of several million years on all of the other species. Because of this, they grew arrogant and believed they were the chosen ones, the true heirs to the Star People. They wouldn't engage with the other species as a result. After several millions of years, their planet's sun expanded to the point of making life on their now baking hot planet untenable for organic life, and so they developed a way to implant their human minds into machines, thus becoming the Gravital. Now at a point where they were arguably more advanced than the Asteromorphs, the Gravital set about exterminating all of the future humans of the Second Galactic Empire, a campaign of mass genocide which was successful. It had taken the Empire 80 million years to reach the point it was at, but within a much shorter time the whole thing was wiped out. All of the species that made up the Empire were now gone, extinct, save for a small amount of bug facers who would become the Gravital's pets and then, eventually, romantic partners. This would cause much tension within what was now known as the Machine Empire, which we'll talk about next time.
The Gravital are a race of machine life forms first introduced in C.M. Kozeman's book, All Tomorrows. They seem to come in a variety of shapes and sizes, with two examples being given in the book, the first being spherical in shape and with the ability to hover, and the second being of a flat slab shape. They each possess an eye, which is red, and have two or more holes beneath it which are likely to act as a loudspeaker for communicating with others of their kind. They possess no external limbs, but have the ability to move objects and change the world around them by use of subtle manipulations of gravity fields. The Gravital first began life as Star People, genetically modified humans created in a joint effort between Earth and Mars following a catastrophic interplanetary war somewhere around the 31st century, many thousands of years after the Star People had spread throughout the galaxy and colonized an untold number of worlds. They came into contact with the primary antagonists of the story, the alien race known as the Q. While many details of the initial contact between the Star People and the Q are not known, it is known that the Star People did put up a great resistance against the Q invaders, and as each colonized world fell to the Q one by one, the inhabitants of these worlds were conquered and then genetically modified into a variety of strange and often horrifying new forms. Many millions of years ago, on the Gravital's homeworld, the Star People had fought the Q and lost, as did all the other worlds. The people of this world were captured and modified into something else. This new form was quite human-like when compared to their counterparts on most other Q-conquered planets, such as the Titans, the Lopsiders, or the Temptor. These new beings, the former Star People, came to be known as the Ruin Haunters. As can be seen from the illustration, they have retained a mostly human appearance, the only feature that would really distinguish them being their large, drooping noses. The Ruin Haunters name comes from the fact that, unlike on other worlds, the Q this time hadn't really cleaned up after themselves before leaving. While on other worlds the Q had wiped away all traces of the Star People's society and technology, they hadn't, for reasons unknown, done the same on this planet, or at least not to the same extent. When the Q had genetically modified these Star People into the Ruin Haunters, they apparently hadn't gone to the same lengths as they had with their other twisted creations when suppressing their intelligence. They had been reduced to the level of hunter-gatherers, but their ability to regain their sentience and intelligence had not been taken away from them. After the Q moved on from this world, they left behind much Star People technology, and Q technology as well. This meant that, instead of their society progressing naturally as many of their cousins did on distant worlds, slowly and painfully evolving towards the level of advanced civilization, the Ruin Haunters instead had an immense level of ancient alien technology completely at their disposal, right from their beginning, not having earned any of it. For the first few thousand years, it can be assumed that the Ruin Haunters simply wandered about the ancient ruins, not comprehending what they were or what they meant. But over the millennia, as their sentience returned and a primitive civilization came into being, they found themselves able to use and replicate the ancient technology, even though they weren't even close to really understanding it. It had fallen into the wrong hands, young, immature hands. They became spoiled brats of a species, considering themselves the only true heirs to the Star People. Once their relatives on other planets, such as the Killerfolk, Pterosapiens and the Tool Breeders, had begun contacting each other and forming a great alliance, the Ruin Haunters stubbornly refused to engage with them, arrogantly considering all other post-human species to be beneath them and not worthy of the bygone Star People. The technology had been left on their world, and hence they must be special. It was this attitude that would create a deeply ingrained extreme narcissism in this species that would have devastating and catastrophic consequences, both for themselves and for all organic life in the galaxy further down the line. But before this point, there is the question of where the Ruin Haunters ended and the Gravital began. The Ruin Haunters as a race were too young to fully appreciate what they had been left by their highly advanced ancestors, and so they subjected themselves to 5 consecutive world wars, 2 of them thermonuclear in nature. They managed to pull themselves through, hardened by their terrifying and violent history of war, but a new problem was now on the horizon. The sun of the Ruin Haunters world was expanding, and, even with their incredible technology that they had at their disposal, they couldn't do a thing to stop what was happening. Unable to change what was happening to their sun, and with their organic bodies unable to cope with the extreme heat that they were now finding themselves living in, they decided to change themselves. Their level of advancement was such that they could now implant their minds into machines. Earlier models were comprised of a metal shell that would contain the organic brains of the last Ruin Haunters, but later on, a way to store their minds on quantum computers was discovered. These minds were likely downloaded and then installed into machine bodies, eliminating the need for human brains and thus bringing to a close the era of the Ruin Haunters and giving birth to the galaxy's first fully inorganic machine civilization, the Gravital. By this point, the Gravital had become the most advanced post-human species in existence, even more so than the Asteromorphs, who themselves had by now attained a godlike status. They had spent millions of years convinced that they were the Star People's true heirs and had, like the Q before them, declared themselves the rulers of all in existence. The Gravital used enormous sails, millions of miles across, to block out each planet's sun, and this was done with such efficiency that every attacked world was caught completely off guard. Over a 10,000-year period, they invaded, annihilated, and caused the extinction of many post-human species, peoples who had suffered through millions of years of evolution to reach the point that they were at, Type 2 and Type 3 civilizations. The Snake Peoples, the Killerfolk, the Asymmetrics, all were wiped out, except one. The bug facers, for reasons unknown, weren't completely wiped out, and the Gravital instead chose to keep them as pets. They used the ancient art of genetic manipulation to change these people into new forms, just as the Q had millions of years before them. The bug facers became known as the Subjects, and were owned by the Gravital and existed as the only organics in the new machine empire. It has been stated in the book All Tomorrows that the Gravital, despite their efforts to wipe out and destroy all of their post-human relatives, didn't hold any particular hatred towards them, and their destruction was simply because the Gravital didn't acknowledge them as alive. In much the same way that we humans eat vegetables that grow, or mow the grass on our lawns and gardens, both of which are alive and grow, the Gravital destroyed them because, while they knew the post-humans were alive, they didn't fully acknowledge that they were living things, and simply thought of them as being in the way. They had spent too long in their machine forms, too many millions of years removed from their organic ancestors and relatives on other planets, and too long believing themselves to be the center of the universe, that it had become completely impossible for them to identify with organic life on any conceivable level. The Gravital were responsible for the greatest mass extinctions and genocides that the galaxy had ever seen, but they did not consider themselves evil, and they were not a race of heartless mechanical automatons with no thoughts or feelings of their own. They still had human minds stored within them, and they had their own thoughts, feelings and ideas which often put them at odds with others of their kind. The machine empire, made up of the Gravitals, was often struggling with internal conflict, and in order to divert the attention of its citizens away from these troubling issues, a new enemy was needed, something to unite the machines. Their millions of years of egomania had finally reached its fever pitch, and the machine empire declared war on the godlike Asteromorphs. The war between these two empires was perhaps the most cataclysmic to date, with some conflicts lasting millions of years. It would spell the end of the machine empire. They lost the war, and the Asteromorphs destroyed them, thus bringing an end to the machine empire and the Gravital, once and for all.
The Machine Empire from C.M. Kozeman's All Tomorrows is the name of the empire comprised of a mechanical future human species known as the Gravital. The Gravital come in a wide range of physical forms, with 3 examples being given in the book. The most notable of these forms is the orb-shaped variety, which can be seen here, one in the foreground and one in the background. The Gravital began life as a Q-created species called the Ruin Haunters. Unlike other worlds that the Q visited, the Star People technology of this world was not removed and destroyed, and was left in place for reasons unknown. This would cause the Ruin Haunters, in time, to believe that they were the chosen ones, gifted with ancient tech for divine purposes. It is for these reasons that the Ruin Haunters would never open up to or engage with the Second Galactic Empire, coldly and arrogantly dismissing them. Later on, with the expansion of their world's sun, life would become extremely difficult for the Ruin Haunters on their now baking hot world. They could not change their sun's activity, but they could change themselves and adapt to it. They would create mechanical bodies in which to implant their minds. They moved around by hovering above the ground, using subtle manipulations of gravity fields to change the world around them. Over the ensuing millions of years, the Machine Empire would plot the destruction of the Second Galactic Empire, who they had deemed unworthy of the ancient, worshipped Star People. When the time was nigh, the Machines would exterminate the peoples of each of these worlds. They did this over a 10,000-year period by using million-mile-wide sails to block out their suns, blanketing their worlds in darkness and freezing them out of existence. This would take place on all but one world, that of the Killer Folk, who, for reasons unknown, required a direct assault to subdue them. All but one race would be brought to extinction through these means, but it must be remembered that the Gravital didn't undertake this genocidal campaign as a form of racism towards the other future humans. It was done with the banality of an engineer tearing down an abandoned building, according to the author. The Gravital could simply no longer acknowledge the other species' humanity, and so to them it was seen as more of a pest extermination, destroying lesser life forms that were encroaching on their territory and causing them grief. But despite all of this genocide, the Gravital were still very much human in their ideas, dreams and faults.
While the Machine Empire had, by the end, wiped out all of the other future human civilizations, a small number of one species had somehow managed to survive. These were the Bugfacers, who were quickly snatched up by the Machine Empire and forced into slave labour. Some were placed into artificial environments and allowed to live in a strange parody of their natural existence for the Gravital's entertainment. Sounds horrible, no? Well, if you've ever been to the zoo, then you're not allowed to feel outraged. Others were made into one-off creatures, doomed as there were only one in existence. They would become known as the Subjects. But with these modifications, new schools of thought would begin to emerge among Gravital thinkers. They wanted the organic life forms to enjoy the same peaceful lives that the machines had. After this, the Machine Empire would reign for 50 million years. Throughout this time, the Empire would slowly begin to buckle under the weight of internal conflict, much of it stemming from harsh and bitter arguments regarding the treatment of the subjects. Some wanted them to remain as tools and slaves, while others wanted them to be full citizens with all the same rights as the machines. Romantic relationships between subject and machine had often taken place in private, but attitudes were beginning to change and this was slowly becoming more and more acceptable. But not to everyone. When those on the side of the subjects declared their belief that a number of worlds should be set aside for the development of unrestrained and unrestricted organic life, all hell broke loose and civil war broke out among the machines. Due to these events, the leaders of the Machine Empire decided that a scapegoat was needed to unite them. Stupidly, they chose the godlike Asteromorphs to be that scapegoat. The machines waged a suicidal war on the Asteromorph Empire. It didn't go in the machines' favour. The Machine Empire was basically wiped out, with only a small fraction of machines surviving the Asteromorphs' retaliation. They would be captured and modified into tools of the Asteromorphs Empire, known as the United Galaxies, which we'll talk about more next time in part 3 of the Empire trilogy. The Amphicephali are an alien race, first introduced in C.M. Kozeman's 2006 book All Tomorrows. The Amphicephali were first seen towards the end of the book, after the emergence and destruction of the Second Galactic Empire, and during the age of the Asteromorph Empire. During the course of the Asteromorphs' exploration of the galaxy and its neighbouring nebulae, they would do their best to keep an eye out for other sentient beings. This was in part to seek out other friendly life forms who they could contact before any form of territorial encroachment could accidentally take place. But also, this was done so that they wouldn't wander blindly into Q territory. The memory of the Q invasion, even though it had taken place many millions of years before, was ever present. It would seem that the knowledge of this invasion and the Asteromorphs' ancestors' evasion of it was still with them. After some time spent probing the neighbouring galaxy, the Asteromorphs came across another life form. This life form was the Amphicephali. Very little is revealed about the Amphicephali at all in the story, but we are provided with an illustration, which we can see here. The image shows an Amphicephali ambassador with spaceships typical of their kind in the background. The short description which we're given in the book states that these beings resemble snakes, with a head at each end, one of which contains a smaller retractile body which was used to interact with the world. In the image, however, we only get to see the head at one end, the one with the smaller body contained within its mouth. This is not a form which had come about entirely naturally. Like the future human species of the story, the Amphicephali had gone through a great many different evolutionary rotations and genetic modifications in their long existence. Whether these modifications were performed through their own efforts, or whether they too had fallen victim to the Q's never-ending campaign of subjugation and remaking of species, is unknown. It could be put forward that, at some point in the Amphicephali's history, they had encountered and been changed by the Q. After all, the Q had gone from galaxy to galaxy performing their horrifying work for over 1 billion years, and the Amphicephali were an extremely old species themselves. Perhaps when the Q met the Star People for the very first time, they had just come from changing the Amphicephali in the galaxy next door, or vice versa.
In a more primitive time, filled with more primitive people, the Amphicephali may have been scorned and rejected, being far too alien for humanity's liking. However, the Asteromorphs had had much time to grow and evolve beyond such things, and so too had the Amphicephali. The two empires greeted each other in a pleasant and friendly manner. They got to know each other. They learned about each other's histories, their customs, and their ways of life. After some time getting to know one another and realizing that their views and philosophies aligned, the Amphicephali and all of the life that they presided over within their vast galaxy were welcomed into the Asteromorph Empire.
The most powerful empire that the galaxy had ever seen, the New Empire was a vast union of intergalactic worlds first introduced in C.M. Kozeman's 2006 book All Tomorrows. The New Empire was made up of several species, the most notable being the Asteromorph gods, the Terrestrials, the Amphicephali, the New Machines, and the Subjects. Following a millions of years long series of wars in which the Asteromorphs eventually defeated the Machine Empire and rescued the Subjects, the Asteromorphs wiped out all but a small number of the Machines, then known as the Gravital. Initially, their plan was to destroy every last sentient machine, but the Asteromorphs soon realized that the machines were too valuable as tools to be gotten rid of completely. The Asteromorphs were able to reprogram the machines and dull their minds, so that they would never again rise up and make another attempt at mass genocide. They were now members of the New Empire. However, due to past events involving the Gravital extermination of nearly all organic life, chiefly that of the entire Second Galactic Empire, the machines would forever be viewed by the Asteromorphs as untrustworthy, constantly eyed with suspicion, and while technically full citizens, they were never truly accepted. No doubt this would have taken a toll on the machines' psyche. They were effectively blamed for events that their ancestors had been responsible for, not themselves. While life within the New Empire would have been splendorous beyond our wildest dreams, it would still have come with its fair share of problems for its citizens. The Amphicephali, on the other hand, were accepted and welcomed by the Asteromorphs. The Amphicephali were a race of true aliens. They were not, unlike the Asteromorphs, New Machines, and Subjects, descendants of humanity. They were from a neighbouring galaxy, which the Asteromorphs had probed while searching for other intelligent life forms. The Amphicephali resembled the snakes of old Earth, but with heads at both ends and a second retractile body that was used to perform tasks and interact with the world. Theirs truly was a long, complicated, and rich evolutionary history. They made first contact with the Asteromorphs without incident, proving that over 100 million years of continued evolution, humanity was finally mature enough to meet other species without quarrelling. But it would seem that humanity had only truly reached maturity in its Asteromorph god form. In its terrestrial form, it was still very much a juvenile species. The Terrestrials were created by the Asteromorphs to oversee the development of new worlds, populated by the descendants of the Subjects. Life on terrestrial worlds was unsuitable for the Asteromorphs, as they could only survive within zero gravity, and so a new form was created from themselves to live on the surface of their subject-inhabited worlds. The Terrestrials were octopedal, walking on long, modified fingers. Their brains were shrunken down, as the gigantic brains of the Asteromorphs would be impractical within gravity. Perhaps it was due to their brains being reduced in size that the Terrestrials grew corrupt. They were bred to act as gods to their subjects, to watch over them and ensure their safety. But for some Terrestrials, the temptation to weave religions around themselves and demand that the subjects worship them proved too great. Small brains. However, for the subjects, it would seem that this actually proved beneficial for them, for they were a primitive people, not yet ready for the lofty concepts that the wise Asteromorph gods wanted them to be raised with. They instead needed religion to guide them at this early stage, and a degree of stability was achieved using this method. But not always. Subject rebellions were commonplace, and they were often exterminated for doing so, before being rebred so that the Asteromorphs could try again. It would seem that eventually the subjects got themselves on the right path,
with the help of the Terrestrials and the Asteromorphs. Following these events, the book makes mention of other sentient species joining the new empire, though they were never really elaborated on or shown in illustrated form. We are shown an image of this unknown future human, but it is not stated what species this individual belongs to, or this species' membership status within the new empire. Later on, the new empire begins to be referred to as the United Galaxies. This would indicate that a great number of other species would join the Empire from neighbouring galaxies. It is also said that these United Galaxies were able to defeat the Q upon re-encountering them, but whether the Q were exterminated or joined the Empire as lowly conquered citizens like the machines before them is unknown. There is also the question of what exactly happened to the new Empire in the end. The alien author postulates a number of theories, one being that their end came as a result of an intergalactic war to end all wars. Another theory suggests that humanity and its allies may have progressed to the point of leaving this plane of existence for a higher one. For now, however, we do not know. We may never know. But humanity's end is not what's important here. It was their journey that counts. As the author says in the book, love today and seize all tomorrows.